So we have 3 papers this afternoon, 1 paper every hour. It's 25 minutes for the presenter, 20 minutes for the discussion, and then we have we'll turn up the microphone to the audience for 10 minutes of Q&As at the end, and that should leave up 5 minutes of a break until the next paper. So let's start right away. I'm looking for Spyros. So the first paper.
Yep.
Can you?
Hi, Johan. Yeah.
Hi, Spyros. You're here. Can you share your screen?
Yeah, of course. Let me do that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. The first paper, Spyros Lagaras from University of Pittsburgh, the labor market effects of pro-labor bias in bankruptcy. So you have 25 minutes. The Zoom is yours.
So perfect. Thank you. I would like to thank the organizer for including the paper in the program. So as you can see, it's a long list of co-authors. So we have Aloisio, Araujo, Rafael, Ferreira, Flavio, Moraes, and Jacopo, Ponticelli, and Margarita, Tsoutsoura. I think Rafael and Jacopo are with us today as well connected. So what we try to do with this paper is basically study how judicial bias and bankruptcy affect the labor market outcomes of employees in distressed firms. So basically, the broad motivation is based on this kind of well-known fact that bankruptcy institutions matter. And they matter in the sense that they play an important role in the reallocation of production factors across firms. So a significant part of bankruptcy institution is the judicial system. And we know that the judicial system tends to be characterized by numerous frictions, especially in the context of developing countries. So you can think about like congested courts, lack of specialization of judges. So however, an important friction that has received less attention is of the judicial system is the judicial bias in the interpretation of the law. So basically, for example, if you consider survey evidence, what emerges regularly from this evidence is that judges tend to perceive themselves as enablers of social justice. So what I mean by that is that basically they are willing to protect the weakest party, even if that means that they have to deviate from the letter of the law. So what does this imply for bankruptcy? What this implies is basically that judges may interpret law in a way that favors the preservation of employment, that basically protects jobs, even if the continuation of the firm is kind of inefficient. So this is what we regularly refer to as pro-debtor or pro-labor bias, which basically brings me to the previous questions of this paper. So what we try to do is we try to document how diffuse, how pervasive is this type of pro-labor or pro-debtor bias in bankruptcy. And of course, given its importance, so we try to see how it affects the labor market outcomes for workers of distressed firms. So to do that, what we will address basically these questions empirically by focusing on the bankruptcy process in Brazil. So, and we believe that Brazil is a setting that offers certain important benefits in basically isolating this specific type of judicial bias in bankruptcy for 3 reasons. So first, overall, if you think about bankruptcy institutions and in general the judicial system in Brazil, it tends to be, it's actually considered relatively pro-worker, right? Pro-labor or pro-debtor in terms of bankruptcy. However, at the same time, there is what emerges from our data is that there is large heterogeneity across courts in the interpretation of the law. So the second thing is we have access to data, to electronic records of judicial decisions for all the bankruptcy cases in the state of Sao Paulo. And we are basically able to link this data with a comprehensive administrative employer-employee data set, which basically allows us to follow workers over time and across firms. And finally, what is important for our empirical design is that bankruptcy cases in the state of Sao Paulo are actually randomly allocated across courts within a judicial district. So what I'm going to show you today refers specifically to the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, but we don't think this is a major restriction in the sense that the state of Sao Paulo is the most industrialized, has dynamic labor markets, accounts for the majority of the economic activity in Brazil, basically contributes 40% of the Brazilian GDP. So what we will do is first construct a novel measure of pro-labor bias. So we will use the text of judicial decisions to do that. Then we will exploit this kind of random assignment to provide some kind of causal estimates of the effect of this judicial bias on worker outcomes. And we will finish, finish by discussing what we think are potential mechanisms that rationalize basically what we find. So just to give you a preview of the findings, so what we find is that workers whose firms are assigned to high pro-labor courts experience an additional decline of 4.4 percentage points, basically in annual labor earnings relative to the control group. So when we decompose this earnings decline into a wage component and the labor market participation component, what we find is that the effect is primarily driven by wage adjustments. And in terms of timing, you can see basically that the effect exactly kicks in at the year of the bankruptcy and is basically larger in the short run, but is persistent actually even in the long run, which means that even after 5 years of the bankruptcy request, you can see that employees in high pro-labor courts earn persistently lower labor income. Okay, so in order to be able to identify what is the underlying mechanism and that basically explain this finding, what we do is first we try to delve deeper into basically what happens, what are the outcomes of these bankruptcy cases, right? And maybe perhaps not surprisingly, what we find is that cases that are assigned in high pro-labor courts, what happens is that they are more likely to end up in the continuation of insolvent firms. So basically, if it's a reorganization case, they are less likely to be converted into liquidation. Or if it's a liquidation case, they are less likely to be accepted by the judge. So this means, actually, we find that this leads into employees being more likely to stay in the distressed company. So overall, what our findings suggest is that employees are willing to accept relative lower wage when they stay in distressed firms. So this, of course, begs the question of why they're willing to do that while the counterfactual seems to do better, right? So we try to basically focus on 3 primary mechanisms. So one is risk aversion, the other is basically switching costs and the labor market frictions, and the last one is information cost, and basically we find support for the last one. So in terms of contribution, let me be brief here. There are a couple of recent great papers that they bring this employer-employee data in bankruptcy. We think that we contribute to this type of papers by bringing the perspective of the judicial bias. So there are papers that they have already focused on some kind of type of pro-debtor bias, and they've shown the effect on firm outcomes and asset reallocation. Our paper focuses on labor, and basically we try to extend the results in a setting where reorganization does not appear to be the primary bankruptcy process. And then we contribute to the literature on the real effects of institutional friction in bankruptcy by focusing on a different type of friction, which basically is this kind of pro-labor bias in bankruptcy. So briefly to talk about the setting, so Brazil had a reform in 2005. So basically they modernized the bankruptcy system. So the law now is pretty similar to US. So there are 2 types of bankruptcy processes: liquidation, which is very similar to Chapter 7, and reorganization, which is very similar to Chapter 11. So what is important in our case is that the law basically is set at the federal level. So it's not state-specific, so it's the same for everyone. However, what is important is that the interpretation we see basically varies across judges and across courts. So basically, we're going to rely on that to create a measure of what we call pro-labor bias. So just let me clarify here that while we call it pro-labor bias, and I will explain why we do that, you can think basically this as kind of pro-debtor or pro-continuation type of bias. Okay, so to basically capture this kind of pro-labor interpretation of the legal provisions in the bankruptcy code, what we do is we rely on these electronic records of the bankruptcy cases in the state of Sao Paulo, and we basically use information on the motions filed during this bankruptcy process, along with the decisions, the judicial decisions in these motions, right? And what we do is basically we identify a set of articles that we consider to be relevant. And by relevant, what I mean that they are important by the legal literature and they appear to be more subject to judge discretion, to judicial discretion. And then we parse the text of these decisions that basically cite the specific articles. We have a set of arrays with legal background that basically classify these articles into pro-labor or pro-creditor. And then we aggregate this information on the decisions at the court level where basically the whole randomization occurs. So just to be more specific, so the measure that we create is based on this kind of 5 articles, okay? So these articles, we've seen that the judges basically deviate a lot from these articles when they make decisions during the bankruptcy process. And broadly speaking, we pick these articles because basically they rule on important aspects of the bankruptcy process. So just to give you, for example, like an example, so Article 43, paragraph 3, what it does is basically clearly states that there are certain secured claims that should be excluded from the automatic stay. So it's pretty clear. So, but what judges do regularly is basically they include these claims in the automatic stay. And what is interesting and important for our interpretation is that they cite the protection of jobs, the preservation of employment as the main reason behind their decision. So basically, you can think about these articles, for example, as I said, like automatic stay, claims for automatic stay, or extension of the reorganization plan, or how the conditions of the liquidation requests to denying or accepting the liquidation request. So these are important, basically, articles during the bankruptcy process. So what we did is we parsed the text of the decision and basically that cites the specific article. So for example, this decision cites Article 64 that has to do with the extension of the organization plan. And we have a set of arrays, and basically they classify, they have a legal background, so they can classify decisions into pro-labor and pro-debtor, and how much basically judges deviate from the letter of the law. So we assign a value of 1 if the decision is considered to be pro-labor, -1 if it's pro-creditor, and 0 otherwise. And basically we aggregate this measure at the court level, because this is where a randomization occurs. And we create a time invariant measure that we don't believe it's basically an important restriction, because in our data, at least, in the period that, like in our period of study, what we see is that there is limited mobility in terms of judges. So 84% of the judges, they don't not change court during this period. And the median court that deals with bankruptcy cases has basically 1 judge. So we can basically extrapolate what we find for courts to the judge level, to judges' perceptions about the bankruptcy process. So here you can see basically that there is large heterogeneity on the court level pro-labor bias. So the median court in Brazil appears to be slightly pro-labor, but still there is huge heterogeneity, right? So you can see there is a lot of values between -1 and 1. So in terms of geographical distribution, you can see on the left this is the state of Sao Paulo, and you can see basically the boundaries of the judicial districts. And what we do is we classify districts on low pro-labor and high pro-labor districts based on the labor, the pro-labor bias score of the courts, and we weigh based on the decisions. So this is not what we will use for identification, but the point I want to make is that here in the coastal areas, basically where the majority of the economic activity takes place, you can see that the courts are more pro-creditor, but as you go more into the rural areas, you can see that the courts become more and more pro-debtor, right? So pro-labor, right? So in the right side, though, is exactly like the randomization that we will use, the variation that we're going to use. So for example, here, there is this specific district, judicial district, let's say the Campinas district, that has 10 courts. So the courts here, the dots here represent courts. And as you can see, half of the courts are considered to be high pro-labor courts, half of the courts are considered to be low pro-labor courts. And this is where the randomization occurs, right? So you file a bankruptcy in the judicial district, and then you are randomly assigned to one of these courts. But you don't know if it's going to be pro-high or low pro-labor. So another important thing for us is basically to demonstrate that this measure is not correlated with other court efficiency measures that have been shown to affect judicial outcomes in bankruptcy. So, for example, you can see there are no difference in the backlog of cases. There are no difference in the days it takes to resolve these cases, which may reflect the complexity of the cases and the specialized, or like the judge's experience and specialization. So, just briefly, I mentioned that we will use employer-employee data. The point that I want to make here is basically that we will focus on around 1,000 bankruptcy requests between 2005 to 2013. So we only restrict our sample to bankruptcies after the bankruptcy reform. And these bankruptcy requests basically affect around 100,000 employees. And we follow them 5 years before and 5 years after the bankruptcy request. So for our identification, we want to basically provide causal estimates of this kind of judicial bias in bankruptcy on the labor outcomes of employees. So what is the primary econometric challenge is, of course, like there can be a correlation between the local labor market characteristics and the pro-labor bias measure at the court level. So to basically circumvent this problem, and what we think like helps us like provide causal estimates is this kind of, we exploit this kind of two important institutional features in our setting. So the first one is that bankruptcy requests have to be filed in the judicial district where the firm is located. So there is no forum shopping going on in bankruptcy in Brazil. So the second thing is that within the state of Sao Paulo, cases, as I said, are randomly assigned across courts within a judicial district. So there is a central office, bankruptcy cases are coming, and they allocate them randomly on different courts within a judicial district. So basically, our main specification is a typical event study differences. So where basically at the employee level, so Y is an employee outcome for worker I, whose firm went bankrupt or filed for bankruptcy in year K, in the judicial district J, and what happened is that the case was assigned in court C. So what is important here in our specification is this fixed effects here, A, J, K, basically, which is the judicial district times bankruptcy year fixed effects. So what it does is basically, think about that we have two workers whose firms filed for bankruptcy at the same year, at the same judicial district, but one case was assigned to a high pro-labor court, one case was assigned to a low pro-labor court. So basically, we keep so it's within the same type of local labor market. Basically, it depends on the only thing that the only difference is that you are assigned to a different type of, let's say, judge. Okay, so this is why we think our empirical specification provides causal estimates. However, we want to show here, we test basically this kind of random allocation. And as you can see, worker, firm, and case characteristics, they do not appear to correlate with the decision to allocate basically the bankruptcy case to a high or a low pro-labor court. Okay, so this is just like for robustness, just to make sure that our measure is, that the allocation, the assignment of cases is basically random. So for our main finding, what we focus first is on the earnings trajectory of the employees. So as you can see here, for example, in column 2, where it's our preferred specification, where we include employee controls and employee and year fixed effects, and this judicial district times bankruptcy year fixed effect, what we see is that workers that are assigned to a high pro-labor court experience an additional 4.4 decline in earnings in the post-bankruptcy period. So like notice, of course, that this is on top of the 8%, right? So overall, in low pro-labor courts, employees basically experience an 8% decline, which is kind of reassuring for us because in US, the decline is almost like 10% in bankruptcy cases. So as you can see, when you are assigned to a high pro-labor course, you incur basically extra costs of 4.4% in terms of labor earnings. And as I told you, in terms of timing, you can see that the effect basically kicks in exactly at the year of the bankruptcy. And then, although there is some convergence, it's pretty much persistent in the 5-year post-bankruptcy period. So persistently, workers in high pro-labor courts earn lower labor income in the 5-year post-bankruptcy period. So then when we decompose this earnings decline into a wage and a labor market participation component, what we see is that the effect primarily comes from a decline in wages. So basically, in the post-bankruptcy period, workers whose firms are assigned to high pro-labor courts earn, on average, a 3.4 lower average wages in the post-bankruptcy period. While if you look at labor market participation, although there is, like, bankruptcy has an effect in basically in the intensive and extensive margin, of course, of labor market participation, the effects are not differential between high and low pro-labor courts. So the effect is primarily driven by wage losses. So before delving deeper into the mechanism, we have some interesting, what we think they are interesting, basically heterogeneous effect. So we focus on skill, and for skill, we basically use the educational attainment, and we have comprehensive detailed information on the occupation, and we focus on the occupations of the workers. And what we find interesting is that although bankruptcy overall has a different effect for high and low skilled employees, you can see that if you are assigned to a high pro-labor court, basically you experience a negative, like an adverse, like a decline in your earnings in the post-bankruptcy period. Now, in terms of occupation, just let me briefly mention that there is no differential effect for managers, but managers overall, they seem to have like a stigma. So they experience the largest effect. And then the effect increases, increases the lower the skill or the specialization of the occupation is. So, but what is interesting is that the differential effect mostly comes from specialized people in specialized occupation, in high-skilled occupation. So which our interpretation is that these people basically have a lot of firm-specific human capital, and they are more willing basically to stay in the distressed firm and accept a wage decline. So that's our interpretation, but I'm happy to hear your feedback on that. So,
Spyros, sorry to interrupt, Johan speaking. You have about 1-2 minutes to...
Oh, sorry, I did, yeah. So to shed light basically on this mechanism, what we do is we focus on the bankruptcy cases, the outcomes of the bankruptcy cases. And what we see is that high pro-labor courts, not surprisingly, when we focus on organizations, they are less likely to be converted on liquidations. And when we focus on liquidations, they are more likely to be dismissed by the judge. So there is this kind of evidence that high pro-labor courts are more likely to lead to the continuation of the firm, as we can see here, and the continuation of employees in the distressed firm. So let me now give you just, in the last minute, like a discussion of the potential mechanism. So what we find is consistent with high pro-labor courts lead to firm continuation and employees staying in the distressed firms. So basically, because the effect comes from wages, workers are willing to accept relatively lower wages. So what do they do that? So we focus on 3 mechanisms: risk aversion, adjustment cost, and information cost. So what we have in mind with risk aversion is basically that on average, you make lower earnings, but you basically avoid experiencing this kind of labor income volatility. Then adjustment costs, they have about like occupational switches or sectoral or geographical, like moving around different places. And information costs, what we do is we think about heterogeneity in search costs for a new job, and we will use the internet diffusion at the local level. And what we find is that we find basically support for the information cost channel. So let me basically conclude that what we see basically that there is a negative causal effect of pro-labor bias on earnings for workers of distressed companies. And we think that this effect is consistent with basically imperfectly informed workers settling for lower wage in distressed firms instead of looking for a new job. And basically, we want to basically delve deeper into that. I mean, we can investigate more the relationship between this bias and the ability, of course, to filter this kind of inefficient or efficient firms, and do more about the heterogeneous effects on information frictions. And thank you so much for inviting me to present the paper. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Spyros. The discussant is Rui Silva from Nova School of Business. Rui, you have 20 minutes for the discussion, and you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. It's as you'll see, I think there's sort of a lot of really nice things about this paper, and I think it sort of really brings to light a new perspective on something, or at least was maybe sort of one of my a little bit of my blind spot that I sort of hadn't talked about too much about this issue in the way that this paper is pushing. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So the main, and I'll be brief on what the paper does because you have seen it. So the broad question is, what is the impact of bankruptcy on workers' employment and wages as sort of measures of worker outcomes? And more specifically, is kind of, do this preference for continuation of the firm, restructuring relative to liquidation, does it indeed benefit workers? And so maybe I'm biased because I do have some work in this space, but I do think it's an interesting and important topic. You think that bankruptcies are important mechanisms that we found as a society to sort of get rid of firms that are failing and sort of reallocate those human and physical capital assets to other thriving corporations, then this is a big and important part of the process of reallocation of resources. And if labor is an important part of this mechanism, then this could have big implications for welfare, for efficiency, for growth. And so I think it's an important question. And what does the paper do in a sort of nutshell is the authors use this random assignment of bankruptcy cases to courts together with a measure of court pro-labor bias for identification. Okay, and so as I'll see, I think this is a very nice the way, and they do additional tasks, but sort of this is supposed to be completely random the way the cases are assigned. They do some tests like Spyros showed you, and indeed it seems that if you look at levels or trends of a bunch of variables, they do indeed seem sort of pretty much the same across courts. And so I think this is sort of in terms of getting to causation, I think this is sort of as good as it gets. It is a true lottery. The main findings, and I do think these are quite thought-provoking, the main findings are, I think, seen in these two pictures that the paper has. If you look at log wages, the being assigned to a pro-labor court, what they call pro-labor court, is associated with a drop, a relatively lower wages, not just initially, it's survived for a few years at least. And so, when your company is assigned to a pro-labor court, you actually, as a worker, seem to do worse in terms of wages. And you could say, well, maybe my wages are lower, but I avoid unemployment, and so I'm employed for a longer period of time, where I avoid spells of unemployment. But indeed, if you look at sort of the number of months in employment, in fact, if anything, these results are not significant, and so they don't push it a lot in the paper. But if anything, these folks also suffer in terms of unemployment spell. So they seem to be, if anything, working fewer months and for lower wages. And so I find this the results incredibly thought-provoking. And I'll talk a little bit about the mechanism later on. So they find that the effects are stronger in locations that have poor internet connectivity. So the diffusion of internet is differentially distributed within the different regions that they have. And they find that when there's worse internet connectivity, then the results are stronger, which they interpret as a sign that informational frictions may be behind these effects. Okay, now I'll comment more on that in a couple of slides. Now, as I said, I find these results extremely thought-provoking. The fact that if you're a pro-labor, as a judge, as a court, the firms that you end up sort of trying to protect, if you believe this interpretation, they end up doing worse. Okay, and intuitively, kind of the way I thought about this problem was kind of more or less the opposite view, which is intuitively I thought, well, maybe preserving jobs would be kind of a good thing. After all, if a worker wanted to leave, he or she could do so voluntarily. So why wait for a judge to liquidate your company, forcing you to leave? You then have to find a job in the short term. And so I think this is something that that intuitively, I think naturally, we might be inclined to think happens that way. And if you look at some of the results kind of in the existing literature, in particular this paper by Graham, Kingley, and Hieu, which I think sort of has informed my thinking on this issue quite a bit, what do they find in the US? They find that indeed sort of corporate bankruptcy seem to be associated with a drop in earnings, and this drop in earnings seems to be stronger for those that leave the firms, not for those that stay in the firms. Okay. Now, of course, it's a very different setting. It's the US, it's not Brazil. And so these informational frictions may be very different across the two countries. The identification is sort of, it's not the same. And so there's many, many differences across these studies, of course. But I think kind of these, you know, maybe your intuition, if it's anything like mine, would be more geared towards thinking of the world this way. That sort of one of the things that happens to workers as their firms go through bankruptcy is that some of them lose their jobs, and losing their jobs is, especially if it's an unexpected job loss, is something that is costly for you. Okay. Now, what will I sort of focus my discussion on? It's kind of three points. One is going to be a little bit about measurement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about informality. When you think about a setting like Brazil, you may be worried about kind of informality playing a role, and sort of the way they measure this pro-labor bias. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the mechanism. I think Spyro's already mentioned that this is where they want to push the paper. I really think that's where there's kind of more room for an even bigger contribution, because I think that mechanism is indeed quite thought-provoking. I think, you know, solidifying that notion that informational frictions lead to these losses, I think could be quite profitable. And then I'll talk maybe a little bit about policy implications, because I think this paper can have very significant policy implications. Okay, so talk a little bit about measurement. So first, you know, if you want to do a paper about sort of what happens to workers in a country like Brazil, you might be worried, or at least my sort of initial one initial concern that I would have is that maybe what is going on is that there are some workers that are not picked up. And so they say we have this data set that covers pretty much universal formal workers, but what about informality? And Brazil, there's, you know, estimates range, but it ranges on order of say 15 to 40% of the economy is in the informal sector. And of course, since you can only observe formal employment, you know, you may wonder whether this leads to any bias. Now, I think that the more natural bias would actually be against the results that the authors find. So I don't think it's, you know, the more natural way of thinking about whether informality would affect the results would be that since they focus on firms and workers that are in the formal sector at the time of the bankruptcy, those workers whose firm is liquidated are the ones that are more likely to go and find employment in the informal sector. Those that retain their jobs in the formal sector, you continue to observe them. And so if anything, I think it would be, this would sort of bias the results against the authors, in the sense that the workers in the firms that end up being liquidated, there is those workers in firms that are judged by judges, courts that are not pro-labor biased. Those are the ones where you see potentially a bigger sort of lower formal wages, longer formal unemployment spells, because they sort of turn to informality, which is not what they find. And so I think it's sort of good news for if you're worried about informality. I think I'm sure you can cook up other kind of more convoluted stories of how informality could bias the results in the way that they find. But I think my first thinking on this issue would be that actually what they're finding may even be an underestimation of the true effects on wages and employment. And so I think this is sort of good. The second thing that I would like to think about in terms of measurement is the way they measure, or the classification of courts into pro-labor biased or not pro-labor biased. Okay, and so pro-labor bias effectively means being prone to kind of restructure instead of liquidate. And the way that they classify these courts is because of what the judges themselves use as a justification to not liquidate the firms and to avoid some actions. Okay, and you see that indeed those justifications, the fact that they say we're not going to liquidate the firm because we're going to protect workers, indeed they ended up sort of leading to less liquidations and kind of more reorganizations, if you will. Now, the cynical among us may think that this justification could be just a way of justifying choices for other reasons. That is, if I want to do something different from the letter of the law, one way of kind of covering my decision would be to say, well, I'm doing this for the workers. And so, you know, I think you could, I don't know if this and this, I think is something that maybe, you know, better understanding of the institutional setting would mean that this is maybe incredibly unimportant. But what I'm sort of more specifically, what I'm thinking, what I have in mind is things like, you know, if you, let's say there's sort of some corruption, and some courts are more prone to corruption than others. So some courts follow the law, the other ones are willing to deviate the law, to deviate from the law for other corruption reasons, or just these are judges that are rogue judges. They want to do whatever they want to do instead of following the law. Then the worry would be that what you're calling pro-labor is in fact sort of pro-corruption or pro-just erratic behavior. That is, I think what you have in mind, or the way I read the paper as it is written, is that there are certain firms, there's kind of a spectrum of firms that should be reorganized or liquidated. And some firms would be reorganized kind of in whatever court. Some firms will be liquidated no matter which course you go to. And as you go through a more pro-labor court, you would move the sort of the needle a little bit and go from sort of reorganize more firms. And so you sort of this marginal firm that was going to be liquidated in a non-pro-labor court, in a pro-labor court, it's not liquidated. Okay. However, I think the concern would be that if you go to a judge that doesn't follow the rules, they just sort of liquidate the wrong firms, reorganize the wrong firms. On average, they do indeed reorganize more firms. They do indeed liquidate less, but it's just they have an erratic behavior. And so I think, you know, it might be easy just to provide either a little bit more institutional background on sort of why this is not the case, or a few tests showing that indeed firms that look like they should be reorganized, they are reorganized in both types of courts. Firms that seem like they should be liquidated, they are liquidated no matter what. And you're really indeed picking up these kind of marginal firms. So there's kind of this notion of monotonicity that you are indeed picking up, which I think from reading the paper is what you have in mind. Otherwise, you know, the concern would be that your tag of pro-labor is actually picking something else at the court level. So I do believe in your randomization, by the way. So I do believe that this is something that is randomly assigned to courts, but it just so happens that courts that are pro-labor, they are, you know, maybe just more erratic or more prone to corruption indeed, and sort of deviating from the letter of the law. And so I think it could be nice to just provide a little bit more background here. Then my second comment, and this is where I think the paper could do maybe a bit more, because I think it's incredibly interesting, is on the mechanism. So the paper's initial findings, exactly as Spyridon said, they beg the question that if changing job is so great, why don't workers do it? Why is it that, you know, if the reason I'm collecting lower wages is because I'm staying at a job that pays me too little, and if I just would change jobs, I would be much better off, why don't workers do it? And the answer that the paper provides is that there's these search or information costs. And these are so high that workers may not know there are all these great opportunities out there. And if they don't know, then they don't leave and they stay too long in kind of a low-paying job. Okay, so therefore, when a firm is not liquidated, workers remain too long instead of changing jobs, while the workers in the firms that are liquidated, it's kind of, in the end, ends up being good news because they had no clue that sort of all these good jobs were out there. But indeed they are, they find new jobs, they don't stay longer in unemployment, and they're better paid, okay? And this explanation is based on this cut by internet diffusion across regions, okay? Which I think is interesting, I think sort of is suggestive. But of course, internet diffusion, you know, this is the part, the first part of the paper where you look at this random assignment to courts is, of course, you know, the identification is quite nice. Here, when you do this cut by internet diffusion, I think sort of this is suggestive. But this is where I think you could do a bit more, because of course internet diffusion across regions might be correlated with a bunch of other stuff. Okay, and so even though I think this mechanism is very interesting, I think this is where the paper could push a bit more. For example, are indeed the workers that leave versus those that stay? So are those that don't leave the restructuring firms? are indeed those that miss out on high wages. So if you do a cut, now I do understand that sort of those that don't leave versus those that leave versus those that say this is now an endogenous decision at the worker level. But I think it would be sort of doing something like the test I showed you from the Graham et al. Paper, showing that indeed these are the workers that are staying too long in a low-paying wage. These are the ones that are missing out, while those in firms that are liquidated, even in high pro-labor courts, those still do well. I think evidence of this type would kind of be nice to have. I think it would also be nice to have information or kind of tests on, do the results different from booms versus recessions? That is, in booms, it's where you like this effect to be there. Likely, you're missing out on good wages when there's good investment opportunities. And indeed, sort of continuing these firms is the wrong action, even for the workers. On the other hand, you think, well, maybe in the recession, either sort of a macro recession or just an industry recession, then maybe, prolonging these jobs, who knows about, overall welfare, but at least for the workers, it might be better because indeed there's no kind of opportunities out there. And so I think sort of pushing the results in this direction on really showing that it is indeed sort of this lack of these existing outside opportunities that you're not picking up, I think could be quite interesting. And I think it is interesting because it has important policy implications, right? I think, it's an important question, and sort of having this notion that when you try to protect the workers, you end up harming them. I think is interesting. And so I think, pushing a little bit more, some of these things I'm not sure how easy they are to do, but pushing a little bit more on if these are really about search or informational frictions, then, presumably those workers that left them, whose firms were liquidated and they had to go find a new job, they had to pay those search costs. And so kind of are these search costs, so if you think of orders of magnitudes, are these search costs, are these sort of drops in wages kind of very large relative to what the search costs might be? Are there other things that might be changing around jobs? Maybe just you go to a new job, even if you get sort of a similar wage, it's a more stressful situation. You don't know your new colleagues. The paper does a few tests. And so just to do it justice, because Spyros had to go a bit fast on this part, the paper does do a few tests showing that, it's not about workers changing to new industries or changing occupations, which already be a sign of these adjustment costs. That doesn't seem to be there, but sort of pushing a little bit in this direction, I think would be interesting from a policy perspective. And I think you also kind of be interesting, even if it's a more speculative discussion on what should we do to disseminate information, right? If this is really the cost, what is a good policy? Should we subsidize internet, which is kind of that first cut that they have? Should we inform judges? Should we inform workers that go through this process? Kind of what should we do? In the case of bankruptcies, and maybe even more generally, right? Because if you kind of believe that there's a ton of workers sitting in firms earning lower wages than sort of they could, even in firms that are doing well, there might be some of these workers. And so what kind of policies could we do to make this friction a little bit less severe? Okay, so to conclude, I think this is again, I might be biased, but I think this is an interesting and very important topic, where I think the paper could push further, or where I sort of, if I was on the paper, where I would sort of try to, talk my colleagues into, my co-authors into doing more work, is on the mechanism. I think sort of more evidence that is indeed search kind of informational frictions that drive the effects, I think would be good. Where and when are these informational frictions more severe? How can we try to overcome them? I think this would be great. Other than that, in my view, the paper is a great paper. It's well written, well executed. I think makes an important contribution and points to potential costs of sort of being pro-labor that maybe if you have read some of the prior literature would not see, because maybe you don't see the type of frictions that you see in developing work. So I think that's something that the paper could push even further, and I think where the contribution is the greatest. So overall, really enjoyed reading the paper, and I wish you luck for the next version.
Thank you very much, Rui, for the discussion. Now we're going to collect questions from the audience, and then we'll turn off the microphone again to the authors to answer questions from Rui and the question from the audience. So please, if you want to ask a question, can you use the raise hand button in Zoom, and I will give you the microphone. Okay, Vicente, you can go on.
Hi, excellent paper. I really enjoyed it. I was wondering if being pro-labor in this context is a bundle of various things. So it's some kind of package. And you yourself, sometimes you talk about pro-labor, but sometimes you call about pro-liquidation or anti-liquidation. So I wonder if even within liquidation, more pro-labor judges, even within continuation, more pro-labor judges have different idea of what continuation means. And this doesn't necessarily go against your identification strategy, but it definitely should be something that should be that you should study when it comes to the mechanism.
Farshad, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, very interesting paper. I guess one interesting thing about like a reform 2005 was that it put a cap on the labor claim in liquidity. And I wonder if there is a deviation from that, or looking at in which court usually this cap actually reached could be used to exploit the pro-labor bias in the courts.
Dirk, you can go on.
Thank you. Yeah, fantastic paper. I think the most interesting result here is this notion that randomly displacing workers in badly performing firms is actually kind of good for them, at least from an earnings perspective. This is a question based purely on ignorance. If that's the case, somebody in labor, in the massive labor literature over the last 80 years, must have stumbled across this. Right? I mean, there are a few papers showing that people who were displaced by Hurricane Katrina out of New Orleans ended up better on many, many dimensions 10 years later. There's got to be something similar. I mean, with all due respect to this paper, which is absolutely fantastic, it would be sort of shocking if you were the first one to find that randomly displacing workers in badly performing firms is good for them. I mean, that seems like a really first order result, and it would be nice to link that back to whatever the labor literature has found on in this direction.
Thank you. Spyro, so if you want to take a couple of minutes to answer the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for the questions, and Roy for the discussion. That was great. So, I mean, your comments are pretty much like what we are trying to work on now, basically. So, I mean, informality is always a problem in Brazil. As you mentioned, that's great. It actually biases against our result, but we can do even more in the sense that there are this kind of census surveys in Brazil, that there are some municipality level like variation within Sao Paulo on informality. Maybe we can see if the results are different in each of these cases. So in terms now of what we pick up, that's a big question, right? So we are I agree that we're pretty flexible on how we interpret the measure as pro-labor, because we use this kind of, like judges use this excuse a lot. But just, I mean, in terms of corruption and erratic behavior, what I have to say is that the judges are not political assignees. So there is like an exam, they go, maybe we should mention that in the paper actually. So they go through an exam process, the best ones are assigned to to smaller courts, and then they move their way up. So within a judicial district, we think at least that like in terms of experience or in terms of, I don't know, how they handle cases before, or their career trajectory or ambition or stuff, they are we think that they are at least pretty similar. But we should do something more, or just be more basically clear on what we think that the pro-labor bias measure captures. So in terms, we would love to be able to see if the judges make efficient or inefficient decisions. Now we're kind of constrained by the data because we have no financial information on the companies or any kind of value added. I mean, we can ask for this information. Now with COVID, there is no access to the census in Brazil, so that's a problem. But we would love to do more on that. And I don't know if you have any suggestions about how to do that without looking at financial data or, I don't know, like value added, I would really appreciate it. But now I cannot think of how to do that, to be honest, in a very convincing way. And of course, states and liver, we can do this kind of stuff. And recession and booms, we have thought about it. We haven't thought about it that to delve deeper onto maybe like local cycles or industry level cycles, because in our period of study, we have a very small recession in 2008, and then we have some recession after 2011. We can use that, but we don't have enough variation, but we can try. We can try to do that. And of course, yeah, being pro-labor now, we are very, I don't know how to say that. We are very like loose on what we include. To Vicente, like, yeah, we should do something more, and yeah, and thanks there. Yeah, we're gonna look at the labor literature. I'm trying to think of any papers because I'm working on labor stuff a lot. I will look at the Katrina stuff. I remember there was a recent paper, but I have to check. Yeah, I have to check about that. But I don't know if Jacopo or Rafael wanna add something. But thank you so much for the comments. They are actually great, and they will actually add value to the paper if we address them.
Thank you, Spyros. Thank you, Rui. We take a 5-minute break. Next paper in 5 minutes. The next paper is Corporate Taxes and Retail Prices by Scott Baker from Northwestern University. And right, perfect. The slides are here. Scott, you have 25 minutes.
All right. So thanks so much for being here and for having me. This paper is joint with Stephen Sun and Constantine Yannelis. And it's really a paper that is trying to look at, here we go, look at the kind of a fuller understanding or deepen our understanding of the incidence of corporate tax rates. And so it's kind of a truism, or just like a mechanically true, that corporate taxes are borne by kind of one of three potential people: capital owners in the form of lower after-tax profits, by consumers in the form of higher prices, or by labor or by workers in the form of reduced wages. And so this has been something that's been studied a lot in the past, but mostly in respect to kind of the first and third, in terms of the capital owners and the workers. So there's been lots of work, both in theory and kind of empirically, that look at the incidence on capital and on wages, or on both, of changes in corporate taxes or corporate tax rates in general. But there's been really little empirical work on the incidence on consumers in the form of higher prices. And so that's what this paper is explicitly focusing on. And we think it's kind of important policy relevance, partly because a lot of the, at least in the US, a lot of the official government models for thinking about the impact of taxes and different types of taxes assume that corporate taxes are incident only on capital and labor. Okay, so there's some variation across some of these models in how much they're incident on labor versus capital, but they all are assuming no incidence on consumers, and so we wanted to speak to that a little bit. And just a little bit else, so in a recent article, this is taking sourcing data from Piketty and Saez's paper in the New York Times, looking at the changes in who's paying, what sorts of taxes and what sorts of overall tax rates over time. And here they say in the notes that corporate taxes here are accounted for entirely by or entirely borne by stockholders. Okay, so this is something that seems to be true in official government models, in the literature, in in kind of the media interpretations of academic work, is that corporate taxes are incident on capital and labor, and so we want to investigate a bit more about their impact on consumers as well. Now, if we're thinking about the impacts of corporate taxes on prices, there's a couple of big challenges that we're going to need to overcome. One is just measurement. So especially how we're going to do things in this paper, looking at state level corporate taxes, we have to assemble data with information that both has the retail price as well as what corporate tax rate is incident on that the producing firm. Okay, and this can be difficult to ascertain because tax rates of corporate tax rates where the transaction, where the purchase actually occurs, can be different than the relevant tax rate for the producers of that good. Okay, and so in our context, this would be, most of the producing firms are selling, are located in one state, but are selling in many states across the country. The other thing is that corporate tax rate changes are often correlated with other factors. First and foremost, they might be correlated with, with the business cycle. So states often, and local jurisdictions often, change tax rates in response to changing economic fortunes or the need to balance budgets. And there can also be local demand shocks that might be kind of correlated with some of these changes as well. Okay, and so we're going to try to isolate, try to use an empirical strategy to isolate kind of exogenous changes, or at least be able to strip out the variation that stems from some of these local shocks, or that might be correlated with these local shocks. What we're going to do in the paper is we are going to look again at state corporate tax rates in particular in the United States, and changes, the impact of changes in state corporate taxes on barcode level, so individual UPC level product prices, using a linkage between the Nielsen retail scanner data and the GS1 barcode database, and then various sources of firm data like Orbis and Infogroup's Reference USA database. And the nice thing is that this strategy can allow us to exploit firms that produce in one state and sell in multiple states. And this kind of avoids this endogeneity of the own state tax changes that can be correlated with these local demand shocks or local business cycles. And so we can explicitly strip out that variation with very detailed fixed effects, and just use this cross-state variation. That's the empirical portion. We're also going to estimate a model that is going to enhance kind of some existing models that had capital and labor. We're going to enhance that with the addition of consumers and retail prices there. And this allows us to decompose the tax incidence of changes in corporate tax rates. And we think that this is maybe a bit more helpful to use as an input to some of these policy models that are often discussed. As a preview of the results, we do find some significant impacts. An estimated elasticity, this is kind of a net of tax elasticity of 0.17. So that would mean a 1 percentage point increase in the corporate tax rate yields an increase in prices of about 0.17%. We think that policymakers' model underestimate the incidence of corporate taxes on consumers. So our estimates definitely have some noise, but we certainly get a lot of evidence that the incidence on consumers is not zero. And actually, we also find that these effects are largest for the lowest priced items and for products purchased by low-income households. So if you're thinking about enhancing corporate taxes as part of a progressive tax system, not only are we do we find that corporate taxes are also incident on consumers in general, but they seem to be especially incident on kind of low-income households and low-price items. Okay. All right. So let me take you through the data, kind of a theoretical framework, our empirics and results, a brief discussion of the incidents, and then I'll wrap up. Okay. So when we think about corporate taxes in the United States, you know, there's kind of two layers. There's the federal layer that is essentially uniformly applicable to firms across the U.S., and then there's state corporate taxes that apply to firms depending on where they're located, where they have employment, and where they have sales. We're going to focus on the latter so that we can get more of this cross-sectional variation. And there's actually a fair amount of variation both across states and levels of corporate taxes as well as over time. So like I said, firms are taxed where they have nexus. This depends on the state, these different calculations, and we'll do some kind of robustness to different ways of calculating a firm's nexus. So while there are differences in rates across states, most of them do calculate the corporate tax in kind of the same way, that it's on profits, it's on revenues net of allowable deductions. And so it's essentially going to be a tax on state taxes on profits, just like the federal tax. If we look at the distribution of rates, so these are levels, average levels, you can see that there's a kind of sizable minority of firms that have a rate of 0. And then most states that have a corporate tax are, you know, somewhere in between the 5 and 10% range, and this is on top of the federal rate, which is, you know, varied between 20 and 40% over time. We're going to be focusing especially on these changes in corporate tax rates. And so this is just looking at non-zero changes from year to year, so annual level changes. So some of the changes are very small. You know, this bar is like 0.1% or 0.25% changes in kind of either direction. But some of them are fairly large with multiple percentage points changes in the tail, with quite a few, about 20, that are over 1 percentage point. Okay. So getting into the data challenge, again, the goal here is to calculate for every retail good, calculate the applicable corporate tax rate, state corporate tax rate, for their producer. All right, and so what we're going to do is we're going to link individual retail products to their initial producer. And then we're going to look at that producer and try to determine the corporate tax rate for that producer using one of two ways. One is to use a tax nexus approximation that tries to take into account where they have employment and location and plants or establishments, and where they have sales. Alternate, we can link to the relevant taxing state using their corporate headquarters location as kind of a proxy. For the retail prices, we're going to be employing data from the Nielsen Retail Scanner database, which basically has UPC level prices for lots of different retail stores in the US, kind of across the nation. We're then going to take each of those individual product prices. We're going to map it using the barcode, using the UPC, which is like a 15-digit, unique identifier of an individual product. We're going to link it to the producer, and then we're going to look at producer data from Orbis and Info Group to understand where those producers are located and some other elements about the firms. For corporate tax rates, we're going to use and extend the corporate tax rate database that Giroux and Rao developed, and we're going to extend it using their the same sources that they use. So the Michigan Tax Database, the Tax Foundation, and the Book of States. So when it comes to our empirical framework, we kind of want to motivate it with a simple model to think about the proper specification that we should be running here. So this is we're going to kind of use a simplified version of the Suarez, Serrato, and Zidar paper that came out a few years back, where firms are, Cobb Douglas producers. They have productivity level B, they have labor and capital that they're going to be using to produce output. And so they're going to be maximizing their net of tax profits, conditional on a tax rate, wage rate, and a rate of return on capital in the context of CES demand. And when we solve this for firms' optimal price levels, we get that this level is kind of in logs, and that this is going to be a function of the logged net of tax kind of profit rate. So, if we're looking here, this is kind of where corporate taxes enter the equation. And so this is going to directly motivate our estimating equation that is going to be in this same form. It's going to be logged prices and logged net of tax rates. Okay. And so this is then the empirical specification that we estimate. So again, we're going to be looking at prices, and we're going to be looking at logged prices and logged net of tax rates. So 1 minus the corporate tax rate. And this includes both the federal and the state levels of corporate tax rates for the headquarters state. So P here is going to be the retail price of product I in state S at time T. We're going to have a tax rate, which is the tax rate in the state where the producer has their headquarters or their nexus at time T. And then we're also going to have some other controls. So things like products level sales, tax revenues, kind of local economic conditions that vary by state and time. And we're going to cluster standard errors by state. So the way that we're going to try to account for local economic conditions kind of most fully is we're going to allow this these alphas. And so these are going to be sold state, so the state where a sale takes place, by retailer, by time, fixed effects. So this is actually like many thousands and thousands and thousands of fixed effects. And this is going to hopefully fully capture local factors like state-specific business cycles. And it will also fully capture retailer-specific shocks. So if a whole chain is undergoing bankruptcy and so prices change in a systematic way over time, that's going to be fully captured by these fixed effects. All right. And just to give you an example of the sort of variation that we're going to be using. So take, for example, we have some pizza that's produced in Illinois. We have some maple syrup that's produced in Vermont, and both of these products are sold across many states. So here we're saying, the maple syrup is sold in Texas and in New York. Pizza is sold in New York and California. And so what we're going to be doing in our empirical strategy is to be looking at differential tax changes across states. So say the Illinois corporate tax increases while the Vermont corporate tax is unchanged. what's going to happen to prices of all these different products in different states? Well, we're going to include these detailed fixed effects, so state year and state year retailer actually fixed effects. And basically the unchanged corporate tax rates are going to provide essentially a control group. Okay, so the maple syrup made in Vermont, it doesn't have any changes in corporate taxes that are going to be applicable to its producer. So that's going to be, in essence, acting as a control group to identify these New York year fixed effects. And thus we can look at the differential change that pizza made in Illinois saw during this year after the increase in corporate tax rates in Illinois. Okay, so that's essentially what we're going to be looking at. And if we run this this regression, we see that there does seem to be a significant relationship between the net of tax rates and the retail prices that are seen kind of downstream. Okay, so including more and more granular fixed effects. So this is kind of our preferred specification here, column 5, and we see about a 0.17 negative 0.17 coefficient here on the net of tax rate. And so again, this is if we can think about the effect size as being a 1 percentage point increase in corporate tax rates, so from 8 to 9 percentage points, for instance, for a state level corporate tax rate, yields a decrease in retail prices of about, an increase in retail prices of about 0.17%. Okay. You can see that this is a negative coefficient, and that's because this is a taxes enter the independent variable negatively. All right. We can see that these effects are fairly persistent over time, so we don't see any significant impact of these price changes before they actually happen. But afterwards, we see fairly consistent point estimates, though that the standard errors kind of blow up as we get further and further away from these from the actual date of the tax change. Okay, so we don't see that these effects revert immediately after a year or anything like that. This is partly because the corporate tax rate changes are also themselves fairly persistent within a state. So conditional on a change occurring, there's usually not a countervailing change in the next year or two. All right. We tried to do a bunch of robustness and a bunch of placebo tests as well throughout the paper. I'm going to talk about just a few of them. In particular, one of the nice ones is that we can look separately at the impacts on prices prices charged by producers that are C Corps versus those that are S Corps. And the idea here is that our main results are looking only at C Corp producers, and this is precisely because they're the ones who are subject to corporate taxes. But the S Corps, which are kind of different sorts of corporations, they're closely held firms like partnerships. A lot of the producers are S Corps, but these guys aren't subject to corporate taxes, they're subject to personal income taxes. And so changes in corporate tax rates shouldn't really affect them. And so they can kind of act as a placebo group. So we can run the same specification with S Corp producers, and we find that there's no substantial relationship, much smaller point estimates, and nothing is statistically significantly different than 0. Similarly, if we look at the impact of changes in personal income tax rates on C Corp prices, we also get no significant relationship. All right. We try a bunch of different robustness, so things like equal weighting versus sales weighting firms, using alternate definitions of tax nexuses, like I mentioned. We can exclude any given state or any given tax change. We can exclude any given product category or any given type of retailer. So, pharmacies versus, fresh food stores versus grocery stores versus other sorts of retailers. All of the results basically go through and kind of qualitatively unchanged. A couple other nice components is that we see that there's kind of variation in how states apportion their corporate taxes. So some states levy corporate taxes entirely by firm sales. Okay, so they say we're only going to charge you corporate taxes on the fraction of sales that you sold in this state. Okay, And that means that because most of these producers are selling to many, many states, that means that corporate tax rates in the home state will basically not have large effects on the firm's profitability, and especially not on the out-of-state profitability of the firm. And so actually, if we isolate or if we add interactions with this sort of full sales apportionment, we find that changes in corporate taxes among those firms located in those states have much, much lower impacts than changes in corporate taxes for firms located in other states that don't engage in this full sales apportionment. A second thing that we look at is that there are these things called throwback and throwout rules that basically have the opposite effect. They act to boost the impact of the home state corporate tax rate by including more corporate taxes and taxing more of a firm's activity out of state when those out of state states don't have substantial corporate taxes, essentially. And so we actually see larger impacts among firms located in these states when those states' corporate tax rates change. Okay, so this is just kind of some sanity checks here that these results go in the direction that we would expect. We do one additional sanity check, which is in a wage elasticity calculation, which says, which is basically looking at, given this price elasticity that we estimate. This goes back to the kind of previous motivating model. If we assume that capital is supplied perfectly elastically, and we can kind of calculate and back out this wage elasticity. Okay, and we want to see if this is kind of similar to what others have estimated as a wage elasticity of corporate tax rates. So if we take the capital and labor shares from the BLS from a couple of years back, we basically back out a wage elasticity of about 0.43 that is implied by our price elasticity. And this is actually really similar to some of the wage elasticities that have been calculated in previous research. All right, so two last things I want to get to. One is about the incidence of corporate tax rates across labor, capital, and consumers. And then also, we wanted to understand, if we're thinking about incidence, if we're worried about incidence because a lot of the tax calculations and optimal tax models have to think about levels of progressivity and differential impact across the, say, income spectrum. We wanted to look at these impacts separately by the price or the type of goods that are being sold. Okay, so because I only have a few minutes left, let me kind of briefly go through this model that we use to decompose the incidence of corporate taxes. So we're going to enrich this Foist-Peikel and Seaglock paper that was looking at, more explicitly at capital and labor incidence. We're going to allow for changes in consumer welfare as well through prices. We're going to have three actors then. We're going to have consumers who are maximizing utility given a budget constraint subject to personal income rates and wages. Workers in state, they're going to be workers who are maximizing subject to, again, personal tax rates and wages there. And we're going to have a representative firm that faces a corporate tax rate and is going to be maximizing profit. Okay, so we can solve this system of equation, and what we end up estimating empirically is this delta P, this elasticity of retail prices, and it can basically act as a function as an input to the consumer share of the tax burden. So here we're going to have this delta P in a couple places in this equation. And we're also going to be able to kind of back out this using these consumption and labor shares based on kind of macro aggregate data, and we can take that aforementioned tax elasticity of wages and solve for the incidence on consumers. And we end up calculating that the incidence on consumers of a change in corporate taxes is approximately 31%. If we go and assume that this price elasticity is 0, then the incidence would be about 1/3 on labor, 2/3 on capital, which is fairly close to what a lot of the other kind of benchmark models have been assuming. So we think that kind of this extension basically nests that previous work. The last thing that we want to look at is this differential impacts on retail prices according to the types of goods or the who's buying those types of goods. And if we just split the estimation, so if we run our primary estimates in split by like product price tercile, so just looking at the lowest third of prices, the middle third, and the highest third of prices, we see that the impacts on the highest third of prices are much larger than those on the lowest third. These are actually significantly different. If we look at the prices, the types of goods that are purchased by low-income households, okay, so this correlates with the price of the good, but not fully, because even rich households buy some low-priced goods. Here again, we see this is not significantly different, but at least it's kind of directionally suggestive that the effects are larger for goods purchased by low-income consumers as well. Okay, so if we're worried about the progressivity or the regressivity of the tax system, corporate taxes, may actually be impacting low-income consumers much more than we would have realized. All right, in my last 10 seconds, let me just sum up. So we link administrative and survey data to estimate the impacts of corporate tax changes on retail prices. We find an elasticity of about 0.17. We find that the incidence on consumers is pretty substantial, and that there's some potential worries about the progressivity of the corporate tax rates relative to, say CBO or Treasury benchmark models. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the presentation. The discussant is Florian Heider from the ECB. Florian, you can share your slides.
So thanks a lot for the organizers to have me discuss this really nice paper. I have to say that up front. It was a nice job in the sense that it's a nice paper to read. It's very clear that the people did a lot of work, thought about almost everything. What makes it very difficult to discuss it and at least add value. So let me try my best here. So excuse me. The point of the paper is a very simple one, is that we know that corporate taxes affect companies, and usually in corporate finance we're aware to think about capital structure decisions, maybe dividends. So it's all about claim holders. But there's this other literature outside corporate finance, mostly maybe public finance, that thinks about other stakeholders. So we're thinking about the other stakeholders being the workers and the consumers, in addition to the shareholders or possibly also the debt holders. And so this is what this paper does. It it looks at the impact on consumers, and it does so via the prices of the goods that taxed firms sell. So yes, consumers are affected if the taxes go up, profits go down, and companies recoup that by charging higher prices. Well shown, plausible magnitudes. The paper spends quite a bit of time with back of the envelope calculations also, and using the estimates from the regression to plug into a model. And sort of the headline result is that the incidence of this tax burden is almost equally shared between the various stakeholders. So yes, the shareholders suffer, yes, the workers suffer, but the consumers suffer as well, and more or less all in equal proportion. So this was the 30% that you saw in one of the later slides. And how does the paper come to that conclusion? What are the tools? And it exploits variation across the US states, cross-sectionally across time, of these corporate taxes, because the companies are not just taxed at the federal level, but they're also taxed at the state level. And one of the very nice things of this paper is, because by now sort of this tax data has been around a little bit, is that they match it with very, very granular information about the product sales, the product prices, and linking the actual products with the producer. So that's no small feat. Okay, so that's the variation that you're exploiting. That's your right-hand side variable. That's what's going to generate the variation on the left-hand side variable. So that's the tax changes. That's in levels. I like this paper because it kind of throws me back a few years when with Alexander Lundquist, I think, I don't know, I don't want to overclaim it, but I think we may have been the first to really use these corporate state taxes. And Scott mentioned those sources. Essentially, you have to drill down to the Book of States and the actual state administration, because some of the publicly available data, like the Tax Foundation, is actually not that reliable. But so there's you can check whether that right-hand side variation makes sense. It makes sense. This is great. Of course, the time periods vary a little bit because of the other data sources. So that's why we gotta love federalism. Incidentally, this other paper that they're citing is the German paper that also has federalism, because it gives you really great variation for these natural experiments, not just one, but you have several of them, and you can do your staggered diff and diff. Okay, that's sort of the one chart of the paper. On the left-hand side, you have the C corporations. So hang on. So these would be our normally taxed corporations, and you have the S corporations that basically choose to use personal taxation instead of corporate taxes. Okay. Now what you see is as taxes increase, so that's 1 minus, prices go up. Yeah. And the falsification is that, well, if you don't have that link through the taxes, then you see nothing. It's a flat line. And so if there was something going on at the state is changing the taxes, well, because they don't change these taxes randomly. Now, if it's economic conditions, you would think that S corporations would be affected. You don't see that. Of course, there's a little caveat here, is that means that the S corporations should be comparable to the C corporations, which may or may not be the case. I'm going to come back to that. But it's a very nice, that's sort of the one takeaway, very strong result. Okay, so the one, I don't really have many quibbles with the paper. Here is one quibble I have, and it's only writing, exposition at this stage. It's clear in the minds of the authors because they do, I think, all the econometrics perfectly. But I think the writing was a little bit suboptimal. So, and it was also in the slide. So there's two challenges. Challenge number one, taxes correlate with economic conditions. And then there's measurement of this exposure to corporate taxes and the retail prices. Well, I think actually there's a 1A and a 1B, because these local economic conditions can affect the taxes. Okay, the states change their taxes because they have an economic shortfall. So for example, if they're in a recession. But the 1B is that the economic conditions can also affect the prices in the retailer. So the retailer could be doing badly, or the state is having a recession, people don't have money in the pocket, so they just don't buy the goods. Okay, so that's why, because some of the econometrics speak to here and some of them speak to here, and it wasn't entirely clear. I think this is, I think this makes it a bit clearer, because then you can very easily show, how you tackle the various problems. So the fact that, a company located in North Carolina may react to the changes in the tax change in North Carolina, maybe due because North Carolina just hasn't got money right now and needs to raise the taxes. And you're going to change, they control this by saying, okay, let's have these companies that are not affected by the corporate taxes, but they're affected by personal taxes, and they do not change always together. Or you have these states with the pure sales nexus, which is kind of nice, because then, nexus means that companies operate in many states at the same time. So each state has a right to the taxes from that company, and that exposure is what they call nexus. And it depends on property, employees, and sales in variation across the states. And some states actually define nexus purely on sales. And because they have these sales per company, and they say, well, we're going to look at the company outside the state, so there's very little sales exposure to the state that's changing its taxes, you also shouldn't see any results, and that's what they do. So that's how they do it, and they also have the sort of more like, controls at the state level. Then a lot of there's one thing that we had done in the past, which I think one could use. You don't have to, but I think that could be, because it's not clear that these S corporations are the same as C corporations, nor is it clear that the states with pure sales sort of have the same budgetary process than the states with other definitions of nexus. So there could be some worries. So what we did in our paper is we used adjacent counties. So you just use 2 counties across the state border, and supposedly if there's they have the same economic conditions, as long as this is not a river or mountain, and you should be fine, but the taxes are different. It's a bit of work, but maybe like the last nail in that. Actually, parenthesis, I'm not worried about these economic conditions and tax changes, because actually when you dig into how these taxes change, there's so many idiosyncrasies in the budgetary process and the political process that yes, when they start thinking about taxes, economics matters, but by the time they become into law, it's already like a few years past. So that creates enough exogeneity there so that you're usually fine. I mean, referees want you to do this, but actually the process is so idiosyncratic that they're almost as good as they're relatively exogenous to what's going on in the state elsewhere. Okay, now this thing here, the retail prices depending on the economic conditions. That's nice, because what you can use is you can say, well, okay, this company in North Carolina has taxes in North Carolina, but it sells to South Carolina, and we're looking just at the retailers in South Carolina. In South Carolina, there is no tax change, so that's fine. But moreover, we're not just looking at a state that's not taxed. We're looking at, let's say, companies from Texas that are also selling to South Carolina, and Texas is also not taxed. So you're doing this within state or within retailer, actually, in the end, comparison of producers that are taxed versus producers that are not taxed. Okay, and so this has been used before. You can do this, people that work on loan level data, so it's like called borrower time fixed effects. It's kind of using this methodology, and that's very nice. And then there's a lot of work on this nexus and the retail prices using amazing data sources and spending a lot of time getting it together. One question I had is like when you look at the company headquarters, because headquarters is one way to define sort of a poor man's version of doing nexus, whether you looked at the historical data or not, because that mattered. But you don't have to. That was just a small comment. Okay. Yes, so that's for Nexus. And the second thing is basically on the retail prices. Again, loads of great data, barcode data, linking the can of Coke to its producer from the barcode, and then linking it to other information about where this company has tax exposure and company characteristics. And so that's kind of, I would say that like the real, innovation is this data. I mean, the question is also new and the results are new, but that's where, a lot of work has been done. So let me spend just a tiny amount of the methodology, because I think, again, in the paper, it could have been a bit clearer, and that's because the data is so rich. So let me strip it down and see what's really needed, and then what extra granularity buys you. So suppose you just had one producer in a state. Okay, so that's S. That's the unit that's being treated with the corporate taxes at state level. And then, that happens over time. So we're following the states, many states across time. And then you have this out-of-state retailer. Let's forget about products and forget about other complications. So that's sort of, what can you do with this? Well, you can say, okay, I'm going to look at the price at the retailer who's going to locate in a state and at time t, but it's really at the retailer in a different state. And the interesting question is, what's being treated here is a state at time t. So that's the producers being treated. And sort of as a sort of first diff and diff, forget the R sub indices, and you would just have your group fixed effect, which are the states. So you're comparing within states. And then you have the time fixed effect. That would be sort of your normal diff and diff, because that's the variation goes at the state time level. But because they have this information on the retailers out of state, well, you can say, I'm gonna refine my time fixed effect. I'm gonna allow every retailer differ at every moment in time. So everything that's affecting the retailer or the products being sold therein through time, I'm going to get rid of that. So whether people in South Carolina have not a lot of money to go to the retailer and buy the products from the North Carolina and the Texas producer, that's differenced out. And then the group fixed effect, you can refine that. You're going to say, okay, I'm going to look within the retailer producer relationship. So that was the example of the maple syrup, and so it's always within those relationships. So that means that something like transportation costs, North Carolina to South Carolina versus Texas to South Carolina, that doesn't matter because it's subsumed in those time invariant relationships. And then they have much more data, but that really helps just making the estimates more precise. That's the essence of the identification, is that they can subsume a lot of variation in the retailer. You have the problem that the producers are in many states, so you have to look at, when you calculate this, you have to be looking at this nexus. The prices at the product level, which is fine because you really have this granularity at the products, but it doesn't really, help you that much. You're just going to refine these things at the product level. And then the producers and the retailers span multiple states. So you have to think really what's the retailer's presence in South Carolina and North Carolina and Texas versus the various producers. But that's just computational complications. The essence is you're comparing taxed versus non-taxed producers selling into an other state and taking out all the variation in that other state. And that takes care of this 1B. The 1A depends whether the non-taxed producers are a good counterfactual for the taxed producers. So here comes my question. So I think, the paper is great. And so one thing, maybe moot, because I saw a graph in the presentation that wasn't quite in the paper, is the question whether tax increases are the same as tax cuts. Let me tell you why, because that was the graph that's in the paper. So here you have the variation, you have the change in the tax cuts, and it's the histogram. And tax increases and tax decreases do not come from the same data generation process. Tax increases are rare and large, and tax decreases are small and plentiful. And there are political reasons for that. Typically, the tax cuts, you want to spread them out over time. They're goods, they help you in elections. The tax increases, that's a necessary pain that you want to get rid of quickly, typically in the first year after the re-election of a governor. That's what's happening. So there could be reasons why this is different. I'm not sure I actually do see something here in this, but there could be that the increases may be different from the decreases. It might be just worth checking, and that would make you less prone to specification error. My bigger point is, maybe a little unfair, but the paper is so well done. I think now the question is, okay, so what? What are we going to do with that? What are we going to learn? Are we going to learn something about public finance? That's how the paper is spun right now. And what I find slightly unappealing in that is that to get all the back of the envelope calculations work, they need also the incidence on the workers. And that comes from a very nice study by Fuß, Peichel, and Siegloch, using amazing German data where the tax is at the county level. But it's Germany. You're not going to tell me that the wage setting in Germany is the same as the wage setting in the US, right? So, and you haven't even mentioned anything like that on the paper. So I don't know, I stumbled over that a little bit. And then in the calculation, at some point, you're going to look at, so that's the indirect utility function of a consumer. And you're saying, okay, what's the effect of a price? And then, because if the envelope in theorem, it turns out it's the Lagrange multiplier times the consumption. The Lagrange multiplier is 1 because that's normalized, because income is normalized to 1. But the thing is that, is the P that comes from your scanner data and the C that comes from the Bureau of Economic Activity, they were closely related in the model, but in the data, are we speaking to the same? I mean, maybe if only, I don't know, soft drinks change, then that's not really going to be representative of the consumption share, in that area or whatever. So I think a discussion there would be very useful. So I think, I like the selling it as public finance, but I think to me, and I'm not an expert in that, that would be sort of two weaknesses that are still right now there. Alternatively, you could sell it as a corporate finance paper and exploit so much more heterogeneity at the producer level. Dividend payers, non-dividend payers, well-run companies, not well-run companies, companies according to the product classes, I don't know, loads. Or you could make it an IO paper and you could exploit more heterogeneity at the retail level. How many retails are there? You do it a little bit with competition, but also are maybe products dropped? Because that right now with with the relationship, you can't really quite look at. So there's plenty of things you can do. And I feel that the paper right now is trending towards this, having elements of this and still not kind of maybe trying to appeal to too many audiences, which is, you know, because you can, right? So, okay, last comment, that's a bit of a cheap shot because I don't think it's a problem, but let me just mention that as you're surely aware is that there's now since a couple of years, people have pointed out that these staggered different diffs, so this federalism, I love federalism, actually comes at a cost. And what's the problem is? The problem is that unlike in a normal diff and diff where, you know, you have your control and that's fine, and you have this one treated unit and that's fine. The problem is now you have many people being treated at different points in time. And states that will be treated in the future, as well as states that have been treated in the past, will both show up as controls in the regression that has these two-way fixed effects. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the pre-treatment, I actually don't think, I don't know. I mean, it is a problem if you anticipate, right? If there's anticipation, then, you know, you can't be a control because you're not like counterfactual for treated that hadn't been treated. With the taxes, usually the taxes, you only see reactions as soon as the tax rate comes into effect. Why would you change before? There's no taxes to be paid. But I think the problem could be that if you have different treatment intensity, and again, this maybe relates to these increases versus decreases, it relates with the size of the tax shocks, because if the states maybe react differently across time, then, you know, using them as controls, you know, they'll be messed up there as well, because some of them will be half treated, some will be not very much treated, some will be fully treated. So there's a literature out there, and actually I also direct you to a recent paper by Ivanov, Petit, and Whited that use the methodology in this paper to get around some of those issues, but this is active. Okay, let me conclude. Thanks for the organizers to make me read this paper. I think it's a great paper. I think it's has a lot of work it shows, and it's very carefully done. My main problem is, okay, we know that the corporate taxes affect the prices. So what? What are we gonna do with that inside? Okay, so I urge you to make a decision there, and good luck. Run with the paper. I'm sure it'll do well. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. We now open the floor to the audience for questions.
So again, very nice paper. I'm a bit curious or puzzled by multi-state firms. So maybe let me see if I understand this correctly first. For what I remember from Florian's paper and from what you presented, a multi-state firm gets a kind of share of activity allocated according to its sales, and then the whole pot of the profits is taxed across the different states according to this share, right? Roughly speaking, right?
Yeah. So every state has somewhat different rules about what
okay.
economic activity is kind of considered. But yeah, so if you're selling in multiple states, and especially if you're producing in multiple states, you'll have your profits taxed in proportion in multiple states.
So now with this in mind, suppose that one state raises its state corporate tax. It's very clear that I want to change my prices because the mapping between profits and taxes is not one-to-one. So I want to have less sales and more profits per sale. So clearly, say if the tax has increased, I want to have less sales. I want to decrease my share in that state. But at the same time, I want to have higher markups because, you know, the markup to sales kind of trade-off is changed. So that means that if a state increases taxes, I clearly want to increase my markup in that state, okay? That's fine, that's consistent with your results, but it's not consistent with your model. Your model is a one country, one firm inside that country, and the elasticities change. And this to me has two implications. One, your specifications could be wrong. I don't think wrong by a lot, but maybe you want to check if thinking in this way changes the way you want to estimate things. Maybe it gives you also a different specification. That I don't think is, I mean, it's probably useful, but not super important. But the other one is that I think it's not obvious that you can extrapolate your state taxes results to federal taxes, for example. So if I increase the taxes of all the states at the same time in parallel, I think this incentive that I just explained is not there. It's simply not there. And then we go back to your model, which is fine. So I think your model is a model of the federal tax. It's not a model of the state tax. And I think you should probably explore this both in terms of, do I want to tweak my specification? Maybe you have some additional identification there, but also in terms of extrapolability to a single state, single country, single firm inside that country, which is more what you're trying to do.
Do you multiple questions or?
Let's collect a couple of questions,
Okay.
and then we'll turn up the mic
Thank
to you, Scott, if that's fine with you.
Yeah, sure.
There's a question in the chat from Jose Luis Pedro, which I'm going to read. Jose Luis is asking, should we consider intermediary goods, suppliers? Intermediary goods enter the production function, and so affected firms could decrease the price paid to suppliers. Does it matter? And the other question is, the quality of products can be lowered if taxes are important. Is this an issue?
So, oh, sorry. If there's another one.
Spyro, go ahead.
Sorry, Scott, and just a
Yeah,
question, like, because my what I have in mind, with this like retail chain pricing is that it's kind of uniform and it's very like rigid, right? So it doesn't change that much despite different types of shocks or consumer segregation and demand. So I was wondering basically how you can like reconcile basically the results, like the state tax that they affect pricing, with this kind of literature that basically points to this kind of uniform pricing in the retail chains and in this type of goods specifically, basically.
Scott, if you want to take some time to answer the discussant and
absolutely, yeah. So first, yeah, thanks so much, Florian. That's really helpful. I think you're absolutely right in some of the challenges, and also in thinking about what can be. I think we can be a bit clearer in some of the kind of specifications and what sorts of components are addressing which identification challenges. And I think you're exactly pointing out one of the things we've struggled with a little bit about, like how much to push some of the kind of different results into different fields, or who most to speak to. You're right that we've landed mostly on kind of organizing it around a kind of a public finance central core. But maybe some of the other elements would be worth either paring down or beefing up a little bit. So I think that was definitely really helpful. And a few of all the other small points I might reach out to you via email about some of the other data things. To some of the questions that came in. So I agree. Yeah, one difficulty is thinking about these models in kind of multiple places selling in multiple jurisdictions. I mean, if you have a company that's selling in multiple countries, then you kind of have a similar idea that you're subject to multiple taxes in some ways. But I mean, there's obviously much more complexity there than here. But I agree that our model is a bit simpler than a it doesn't fully capture the kind of a 50 state selling firm and all of the incentives there. So that is something that we could work on a bit. There's a question about intermediate goods. So intermediate goods, we do have an extension that incorporates intermediate goods into the model, and there are some or kind of producers of sellers and producers of intermediate goods that tries to incorporate those and price changes there and how those might interact with the corporate tax rates of the final goods producers. So we do think about that to some extent, even though we don't have tremendously good data on intermediate good prices. And then lastly, Spiros' point about the good specific, the good specific or retailer specific or producer specific pricing. So I mean, we do see a fair amount of variation in pricing across a lot of these states and locations to different sorts of retailers and over time. So I agree that there's going to be some, like menu cost frictions to charging like every individual establishment a different price. But we do see some variation, and that's partly where our identification is coming from. So I think that if you had menu costs going down to zero and you had freely adjustable prices at every margin, then maybe the effects would be, you know, potentially even larger. But so thanks so much. I think that there's definitely some things that we still need to work on a little bit, but definitely points well taken.
Thank you, Scott, Florian, all the participants who are in for a 5-minute break until the next paper.
Okay, great. Hey, thank you for the invitation to present this this working paper with Hieu and Nguyen and Amin Shams. Amin is also online. If anybody has any questions during the presentation, feel free to enter those during the chat. I'm sure Amin will be able to field those questions. And in the meantime, I'll continue to kind of push forward in the presentation given the limited time that we have today. So, technology has transformed the lending industry. So we have existing evidence that lenders increasingly use novel data to complement traditional credit scores. Fintech lenders use different screening technologies and are known to complement banks for small loan lending. Also related to our work, but we have existing work that shows that machine learning models increase credit provisioning, but at the same time increase rate disparity between and within groups. So at this point, it remains unclear if the impact of fintechs and machine learning models is attributable to improved algorithms, differences in customer selection, or simply the replacement of humans with machines. There's just a lot going on, and by using the term fintech, it's really unclear what the differences are in some sense between traditional lenders and these fintech lenders. And so what we're going to do is we're going to drill down and take a really close look at differences between human and machine underwriting. So what we're going to do in this paper is, using a randomized experiment, we're going to directly compare human underwriting with full automation in a consumer lending market, and we're going to shed light on some of the mechanisms that give rise to these differential outcomes. And so when we look at the comparison between human versus machine underwriting, there's kind of two different ways we could think about this. So automation potentially saves time, labor cost, while at the same time increasing accuracy and potentially mitigating conflicts of interest. So Kahneman describes the human limits of information processing. So as a follow-on to that, we're familiar with the fact that tasks such as data collection, data processing, numerical pattern recognition, prediction are strong candidates for automation. And automated lending helps to improve, for example, mortgage application processing time and reduces discrimination. Loan officers at the same time also have incentives to manipulate hard information to get applications approved, potentially raising the specter of agency conflict between the lender and the loan officers. At the same time, a full automation can come at a cost. So human underwriters can review more nuanced information. They can look at soft information, non-standard information for borrowers with thin credit files and low incomes. There's existing literature supporting this. And there's also literature showing that, that human discretion can incrementally improve machine recommendations. So there's a role for humans in this space. On the trading floors, there's evidence that automation does not always improve speed and performance for financial institutions. Jonathan Brogard and Matt Ringenberg have a working paper showing that on floor trading, human traders actually provide a useful role. So here's the experiment. We have a top 10 auto lender who in 2013 launched an automated underwriting system which fully replaces the human underwriter with an automated process. And so what the firm does is they have a human underwriting staff that's been essentially in place since the mid-90s. This is a very profitable company. And in 2013 in January, they started to assign half of the loan applications to a machine and the other half to their human underwriting team. And over this experiment, approximately 2 million loan applications from 4,000 US car dealerships from 40 states were randomly assigned to either the machine or the human underwriting team, resulting in approximately 140,000 auto loans. And so what we're going to do in the paper is to compare the terms and the subsequent performance of the machine underwritten loans with the human underwritten loans. And so a quick preview of our main results. So the profitability of machine underwritten loans is approximately 10.2% higher than human underwritten loans. Specifically, what we see is human underwritten loans offer a lower APR, which perhaps suggests that the human underwritten loans are simply ones that are less risky. But in fact, what we find is default probability of human underwritten loans is higher than that of machine underwritten loans. And so the gap in performance, drilling down a little bit further, is going to be significantly larger for applications with greater complexity and those where agency conflict is most problematic. And so our contribution is going to be threefold. So by directly comparing human underwriting with full automation, we're going to shed light on the role of automation in financial technology adoption. So, you know, if you think about the many things that fintech firms do, we're going to drill down and specifically focus on this. You know, it may be that fintechs do a lot of great things, but, you know, one of the things that they're doing along the way is potentially doing some automation, and we're going to essentially carve that piece out and look at that directly. The adoption of technology and alternative data in lending has also been examined. So digital and social footprints can be used to develop new effective credit scoring systems. Fintech lenders have been known to reduce discrimination and outperform traditional lenders in terms of processing time and default probability. And so what we're going to do is show that the difference in performance between fintech and traditional lenders is at least partially attributable to the more widespread use of automation. The other thing that we're going to shed light on is the agency problem in lending and how machines potentially mitigate that problem. So volume-based incentives for loan officers are known to lead to lower lending standards and higher default rates. And gaming behavior is particularly prevalent around discrete cutoffs in loan origination in the mortgage space. And so what we're going to do is show that humans are more likely to approve and fund loans right below critical loan-to-value cutoffs. And these underwritten loans are going to perform poorly and actually be priced in a way that leaves the lender with less profit. And so let me go a little bit into the lending process. So this is an indirect indirect loan setting. So this in the United States constitutes about 85% of lending. And so, you know, after a customer walks into a dealership, expresses interest in financing, what they're going to do is complete a credit application. The dealer will then send these credit applications to 3 to 10 lenders who will then bid on the process, bid on these applications. And this is kind of where the experiment comes in. So half of these applications that come to this specific lender will be assigned to the machine. The rest will be assigned to a human underwriter. They will review the applications. They will approve or decline to bid, or they will offer an APR that's essentially the price that they offer on this particular loan. And then at that point, if they're assigned, meaning if they win the auction, the dealership will then haggle with the consumer and try to get some additional terms underwritten, and then it ends up essentially in the traditional loan servicing process. And so let me drill down a little bit into the differences in the process. So the applications have about 25 different fields that need to be assessed, and all of these have some potential impact on the riskiness of the borrower, right? So there's FICO scores, so credit scores, potential bankruptcy, debt to income ratios, the make, model, mileage of the vehicle, the loan to value ratios, the employment history of the borrower, lots of different concepts. And so presumably if I went to almost anyone in the audience and I said, hey, what do you think your market rate is for, your true rate for what your APR should be? You'd probably have a hard time doing it because you're essentially having to gather up a lot of information to be able to price this. And so to simplify the world, what lenders typically have done over, the last, essentially forever, is they've essentially tiered people. So they said, look, if you're in a kind of a FICO range of this with income of that, and you don't have like a car that's unreliable, we're going to price it in tier 1, and then if there's a problem, it'll be tier 2, tier 3, and so on. And so the machine, on the other hand, will simply take all these inputs, will crank out a price, and will respond in that way to the dealerships. And so, mind you, this isn't a matter of like coming up with a the best model between these two. It's a matter of that the humans can't process the information in this way. And so, you know, I think it bears emphasizing that this lender has been doing this for decades, and the original process of human underwriting essentially is what countless underwriters even do to, countless lenders still do today in this market. It is really the largest ones that have started to switch to machine underwriting. And so here are some, you know, some typical guidelines. This is just really to emphasize the fact that, you know, our lender's not unique in doing this. Most of the lenders in this space all have these sort of tiered, like credit score 780, you get one price, you know, 725, you get another, and so on. And so looking specifically at our data provider, this is an auto finance company that's among the top 10 market share. It's representative of indirect lenders, which constitute 83% of automotive lending in the United States. From the summary stats, maybe the thing to emphasize here, we're talking about subprime lending. Very few of these individuals own homes. They have FICO scores, you know, in the 500 to 600 range. Typical purchase is a car that has about a $14,000 book value, 40,000 miles, and is about 2.5 years old. Typically, APR that people pay for this is about 19%. The loan to value ratio is in excess of 1, meaning every borrower or most borrowers that purchase a car are going to be underwater right from the get-go. You'll also see here that the likelihood of default within 24 months is about 10%. So a lot of loans end up going into default with subprime lending. And so one of our primary measurements here is going to be the profitability of the loan. So what we're going to do is simply look at all the payments that the lender receives over the life of the loan, discount these back, and these will be payments prior to default. And we also in our data observe post-default collections payments, the recovery of the vehicle, any costs associated with the recovery of the vehicle, the auction that proceeds that they receive from the vehicle. Since these loans can be 7-year loans and collections periods can extend even beyond that, and the experiment started in 2013, we're obviously going to have a censored data set. And so what we're going to do is use a machine learning model to predict the default probabilities and then the payments on the loans that we don't, where we don't observe the full sample, to be able to sort of complete our data set. And so here's kind of what the model essentially predicts over the time series in terms of the default probability. The fitted values you can see match up fairly well with the actual results. And so here to the results, what we can see is the machine generates a significantly higher profit relative to human underwriters, right? So this is an experimental setting. The machine generates 2.5 percentage points higher profit. That's a 9.5% improvement relative to the mean of a loan profitability of 26.4%. And mind you, this is loan level profitability, right? This doesn't include capital expenditures. It doesn't include labor costs, right? This is simply apples to apples comparison of the actual loans. And so if we throw controls at this, the results are largely unchanged. Now, mind you, this is an experimental setting. So in some sense, doing this really isn't the proper way to do it, but we wanted to do it to show this for completeness, just to show that, you know, the results aren't going to change even after we put the observables at throw the observables at this regression. So also of note is if we compare the loan profitability of the human underwriters, there are well over 100 human underwriters. The machine comes in at about the 93rd percentile, meaning the machine significantly outperforms most of the human underwriters. So now looking at the APR that the machine charges, the machine prices the loans slightly higher than the human underwriters, right? 46 basis points higher. And this is true for the uncensored sample, the censored sample, and obviously for the full sample as well. Now looking at the loan default probability, we see that the machine also has, in terms of outcomes, a much better loan performance, meaning despite the fact that that the machine charges more for the APR, they also realize a lower default rate, both in the uncensored, censored, and full sample. And, you know, if we change the measurement from the 24-month horizon to say 30 or 36, the results go through. In fact, they get stronger the further out we go in terms of looking at default probability. So there's two potential channels that we're going to explore today that might explain this result. One is going to be related to agency conflict. The other is going to be loan complexity. So one of the things that's certainly clear is, if the underwriters are working within a box, then essentially the circle with the X in it is going to represent the place where the underwriter is most likely to win the auction. The idea being that if I essentially provide a price that's somewhere anywhere in this box, say in the tier 2 box, sort of as I move further to the right and up, essentially the loan gets riskier, so I'm most likely to win the auction, essentially win my commission by pricing it here. And so what we're going to do here is compare loans at an LTV threshold of 125%. So underwriters can submit competitive pricing for loans just below 125. If they go above 125, there may be additional exceptions required, higher pricing and so on. And so what we're going to do is compare the loans immediately above and below this threshold. There's some existing evidence suggesting that this type of behavior has occurred. There's a 2010 paper showing that the number of loans surges at FICO scores just below 620, and this was related to thresholds related to securitization. These loans are also securitized. We don't have all the details in terms of what the thresholds are. That's some work that we're going to have to look into further. It may be the LTV threshold of 125 may also be related to securitization. And so what we find is the percentage of loans underwritten by humans immediately below the threshold jumps from about 50% to almost 90%, meaning almost all the loans underwritten immediately below the threshold of 125% LTV are underwritten by humans. And so what's notable about these loans is that these loans are substantially riskier when humans underwrite them. These loans have lower FICO scores, higher debt to income ratios, and the borrowers are more likely to have been in prior bankruptcy. Now, what's notable here is that if we look at the default probability, the machine is going to outperform the human immediately below the threshold, right? This makes sense. The humans are essentially taking on additional risk with based on the observable characteristics, and the machine is choosing to underwrite loans that are not different. And so here the machine is going to outperform the human underwriters immediately below the threshold by a pretty wide margin. Here at 36 months, human underwritten loans have an 8 percentage point higher default rate for loans below the threshold. That's a 41% lower default rate relative to the machine underwritten loans below the cutoff. So you might think that the humans might get a premium for these loans. In fact, that's not the case. What's actually happening is the humans are pricing these loans lower than the machine by a significant amount. So here the difference is an incremental 27 basis points for loans immediately below the threshold. And so, not surprisingly now, the loan profitability for machine underwritten loans is going to be substantially higher immediately below the threshold. So the machine premium increases to 19% for loans at the cutoff. That's a 5.2 percentage point increase relative to a profitability of 26.9% for human underwriters. And so, one thing that certainly is a possibility here is this is simply a winner's curse, right? Like the likelihood that somebody wins an auction is simply better. And so perhaps all we're finding is the fact that, human underwriters are more likely to simply win the auction. Well, it turns out that human underwriters are substantially more likely to accept loans with these characteristics. Here, what we see is essentially the percentage of lost bids, right? These are bids submitted by humans relative to the machine, and essentially the machine is much more likely to decline these loans, meaning humans are much more likely to approve these loans and send them to the marketplace than the machine. So that's kind of one explanation, and so the place where I'm going to finish is essentially looking at another dimension, which is how loan performance changes with complexity. So for thin credit file, low income borrowers with a history of bankruptcy, we might expect the increase in complexity in underwriting. So low wage borrowers have substantially more income volatility, and human underwriters may find it increasingly difficult to analyze the risk of these loans. On the other hand, human underwriters can review more nuanced, soft information or non-standard information for these borrowers, right? So the thinner the credit file, the less useful the FICO score is going to be. And given the greater uncertainty about the income prospects, perhaps other information that the human underwriters can ascertain might be helpful in reviewing the credit information. And so what we're going to do is we're going to compare the machine premium across 3 debt characteristics: FICO score, debt to income ratio, and the prior bankruptcy record. Right, and here what we see is a 3-dimensional graph. So in the bottom of the figure in blue, what we see is these are for borrowers that have a high income and a high FICO score. And we can see that the difference between the machine and the human is about 2 percentage points, right? So not a huge difference, but as you decrease the borrower's income, decrease the FICO score, i.e. make the borrower riskier, the machine outperforms substantially, right? So at the top of the figure here, we have low income borrowers with low FICO scores, and the machine is going to have a 5 percentage point premium relative to humans. So certainly one thing we want to look at specifically is the complexity. And so we're going to map here is the default prediction errors across FICO scores. And you can see that our ability to predict default decreases as we have borrowers with lower FICO scores, meaning as the borrowers get riskier on the left side of the figure, the prediction errors increase. Much in the same way, when the debt to income ratios increase, the default errors increase, meaning these borrowers are more difficult to make predictions about relative to their default rates. And so if we end up making comparison here, sorry, this is slightly out of order. If we compare the machine with the human on these dimensions, we can see, of course, that the loan profitability increases relative to the humans for these low and low FICO, high debt to income borrowers. And the default prediction error here is going to, we can essentially calculate and predict. And then now if we look at essentially a measure of complexity, the complexity essentially is looking at the more complex dimensions, meaning the higher risk borrowers. We can essentially see that when we interact the machine underwritten loans with the complexity measure, that the loan profitability increases, essentially suggesting that for these more complex loans, the human underwriters are less able to predict the default, and the machine is going to outperform in those ways. And so if we break this up into deciles, we can see that, you know, for the lowest decile of complexity, the loan profitability for the machine is slightly better than the human, but as you increase the complexity of loans, the machine outperforms substantially. What I found particularly interesting is that the machine performance in terms of loan profitability didn't really change all that much from the highest to the lowest decile, meaning the machine was almost similarly able to perform while the human performance declined precipitously as the complexity increased. So to kind of wrap this up, what we do in this paper is we use a randomized experiment to evaluate the outcome of automating loan underwriting processes. And so machine underwritten loans generate substantially more profit, have a lower default probability, and have a higher interest rate than human underwritten loans. The machine premium is considerably larger at critical LTV thresholds where the agency conflict is most problematic. And we also find that the machine premium, profit premium is considerably larger for complex loans. I appreciate the opportunity to present the paper, and I look forward to the comments and discussion.
Thank you, Mark, for the presentation. The discussion is Tobias Berg. You have 20 minutes for the discussion, Tobias.
Okay, thanks a lot, first of all, for asking me to discuss this pretty interesting paper. I'll make a short summary only because I think the presentation was very clear. So this is a randomized experiment in auto lending. 1 million applications have been handled by the machine and 1 million applications have been handled by human underwriters. And the results are the following. The default rates, lifetime default rates, so these are loans with an average of, I think, 5 or 6 years maturity. So the lifetime default rates of the machine underwritten loans is 24%. For the human underwritten loan, it's 21%. The APR is also better for the machine with 19.1 versus 18.6%. So these loans actually carry pretty high interest rates, as you can see. And the volume and number of loans is almost identical between the machine and the human kind of accepted loans. Differences are particularly pronounced when agency conflicts are large and when complexity is high. So the overall conclusion of this paper is that algorithmic underwriting outperforms human underwriting. Let me start with some first thoughts or impressions, or let's say an overview about my thoughts. So first of all, I think it's clearly an important topic. We've seen more and more research in this area recently for a good reason, but I think we all agree that it's important to understand the role of human beings in these type of loan decisions. The setting is great. It's an experiment. It's just a random allocation of loan applications to the machine or to a human being. So it clearly has a high internal validity, and you have 2 million real-life loan applications. So this is also clearly a setting with high external validity. It's not, I don't know, MBA students sitting in a lab, but it's a real-life setting here. So overall, clearly a very great setting to analyze. And I also think with everything that I'm going to say afterwards, the key claim, I find it very convincing. The key claim being that algorithmic underwriting outperforms human underwriting in this US car loan setting at hand. So the nice thing when you have such a kind of random experiment is that descriptive statistics are already pretty informative, actually. And let me zoom in a little bit on the key items in these descriptive statistics. So the paper has 2 million loan applications in total that were randomly allocated to humans and machines. And this is a pretty competitive market because these applications are just sent to a bunch of different underwriters. So in this case, you end up with roughly 70,000 applications, which are then actually accepted. So for where this particular firm actually wins, I mean, both makes an offer and then wins this offer. Credit scores are very similar on average. And now if you look at the differences in APR, you already see that the machines have a higher APR. So the differences in APR is roughly 0.5%. If you sum this up over the life of the loan and take into account that the loan is amortized, then this makes a difference of roughly 2% of the loan amount. And if you look at the default rates, 24 versus 21% over the life of the loan, then this is a difference of 3% between the human and the machines. If you adjust for recovery rates, here you have a car as a collateral, then this is roughly 1% after adjusting for recovery rates. So together you get a roughly 3 percentage point advantage of the machine. So for a $10,000 loan, the net present value here to the lender is roughly 300 more if it's underwritten by the machine, and 2/3 comes from a better pricing or more sophisticated pricing, and roughly 1/3 from a lower default rate. Volumes are roughly the similar as I've already, I think, said so far. So my comments will be structured along 3 key dimensions. The first one is, I want to talk a little bit about this machine versus human race that is taking place here, and discuss a little bit in what extent this is actually special, applicable to other situations as well. And then I'll drill down a little bit on these specific results on agency, conflicts, and complexity. So let me start with comments on this general machine versus humans race. And here I want to talk about incentives, the information environment, and the type of horse race you're doing. So for incentives, we actually have to know what is the objective function here. For the information environment, I'll talk a little bit about what information is available in this setting and whether this is potentially also applicable to other settings. And then the type of the horse race, there are various different papers out there that make different horse races. And I think the type of horse race they are running is typically always key to the results these papers are getting. So first of all, the incentives. The paper contains rather little discussion on the incentives that the human underwriters face. But based on my reading of the paper, my understanding is their incentives are based on loan volume. Okay, and so in the end, the humans originate 70,000 loans with a loan volume of almost $18,000 on average, and the machine originates roughly 70,000 loans out of these 1 million applications with a loan amount of 18,000 on average. So the machine does not really outperform the humans if you judge it by the targets given to the humans. Okay. So this begs the questions, why do humans actually have volume-based incentives? And does the lender actually care about profitability, about volume, or what's the target function here? So I think it would be really interesting to know, is there no better incentive contract than incentivizing based on volumes? Or does the bank maybe use this volume-based incentive functions for humans because the loans are securitized? The paper says that most of these loans are actually securitized later on. So maybe the lender in the end cares about loan volume and therefore also provides loan volume-based incentives to humans. And based on these loan volume-based incentives, they are actually performing pretty well. So I think this is the first important thing to know here, the types of incentives that the humans are facing. Number two, the information environment. What we do have here is more or less hard information. It's more than 10 variables. I think it's something like 25 to 30 variables which are being used here. And these variables are more or less hard information. This setting does not contain any credible soft information that a human being could use. Now, there's one exception to the rule, and that is that dealers can convey soft information in a so-called comment section. So in a comment section, on top of filling out these 20 to 30 fields, the auto dealer can make some comments about whether he or she thinks the client is a good one or not, and maybe clarify some other information. Now, what is unfortunately not in the paper, I highly suggest to provide this in the paper. The paper doesn't say how frequently this information is provided. So if it's only provided in very few cases, then it's pretty clear we have a setting here where only hard information is collected. Even if this is collected frequently, the question is still, is this credible, the type of text that the dealer is going to write in such a comment section? So this is a different setting, obviously, to some loan officer knowing a client for a long time, or loan officer being allowed to ask for additional information or judge a complex set of soft information, like a personal interaction, a longer text, a CD, or something like this. Okay, so I think these results should be interpreted the way I understand it, at least, that in the absence of soft information, machines have an edge over human beings. Yeah. This doesn't make the results obviously wrong. It's, I think, just important to understand the information environment here. And last but not least, different papers actually have different horse races. Some papers compare human beings versus machines. This is what you do here in the paper. Others compare human beings plus the machine to only the machine. So look kind of at the incremental benefit. I think for finding out whether a human loan officer is worth being hired by a bank, we are interested in this incremental benefit. Yeah, I still think the paper is pretty interesting, but just looking at human versus machine. But I think in many cases, what banks would actually do, they would provide the output of the machine, of a scoring algorithm, to the human being. And then the human being can make a lending decision. So this is, in many real life cases, more something like human plus machine. Is that worth more than only looking at the machine? Okay. And one example that you might be aware of are these cyborg chess games. Actually, we know by now that the best human chess players are not able to actually beat the best chess machines or chess engines. But it seems to be the case that if you take the best chess engines and give them to a very good human player, that this very good human player, together with this chess engine, is still able to beat the best chess engine. So has an incremental benefit over the machine. And so there's a host of literature that I partly already alluded to. For example, there are papers that show if you give high-powered incentives to loan officers, you get a better performance than if you just give them volume-based incentives. Volume-based incentives are also known to lead to higher volumes but higher default rates, so there's a trade-off, and the Hyder and Innes paper on loan prospecting described that very well, very nicely in a theory model. In this setting here, it doesn't seem to be the case that you need to provide incentives for prospecting, because these loan officers don't go out in the open and try to prospect for auto loans, but this is all done automatically internet-based. There are a lot of papers on governance mechanisms to avoid agency conflicts, going from a loan review function to splitting the roles of a loan officer and a risk manager to rotation policies. Again, this setting here does not do a lot on these government mechanisms, but simply says the loan officer should maximize volume, and then this is the result you see. And we also have a couple of papers that at least argue soft information is important and human beings are well able to kind of process at least part of these soft information. So again, I don't call into doubt the results of this paper, but kind of the setting with these volume-based incentives and no soft information available, they are kind of ideal for a machine to outperform. And just to, felt the liberty also to include one of my papers here. I've compared in one of these papers actually the default rates, the 2-year default rates across LTV and rating grades, and the rating grades were determined by a machine. And in all these yellow areas that you see here, a human being was allowed to make the decision on top of that, what the machine actually says. So I've called this paper Playing the Devil's Advocate, Causal Effect of Risk Management on Loan Quality, because the additional human beings are what banks would call risk managers. In today's world, I would probably call it the rise of cyborgs, how human computer teams outperform machines here. But in that setting, actually, the human beings indeed provided a significant benefit, even over and above a pretty well calibrated risk model. Yeah, because this was a setting where indeed you could contact the client, you could get to know the client, so soft information was transmitted here and was therefore also important for the lending decision. So the takeaway for number one here is that I find these general results really to be believable and well documented. It's a pretty cool setting and a pretty cool experiment here. In some setting, it's special, in particular because there's not really any credible soft information involved here, and human underwriters face or seem to face these volume-based incentives. Number two, agency conflicts. I found actually this graph pretty interesting here, where you show that kind of these human beings in particular accept more loan applications than the machines directly below this 125% cutoff. And I was really wondering where this is coming from. And I think the paper could even go a little bit deeper here. Does the machine actually learn that these are by and large manipulated loan applications because the auto loan dealers try to manipulate them below the 125 threshold, or what is going on here? I think that would be interesting to understand. It could also be that this is due to securitization incentives. Maybe these types of loan you can well securitize, so maybe therefore the bank or the lender here has an incentive to do these. Last but not least, you write in the paper somewhere that these human beings are given advice by top management to take this LTV of 125% as a guideline. So I was wondering, where's this guideline coming from? Is this a poor top management guideline, or is this a poor performance by a human underwriter? My last point, complexity, is a simple point, and I think, or I hope you can find ways around this. But this is, I like kind of all the other parts very much, but this is a part which I think is currently simply statistically wrong. But there might be ways around this, so I hope this helps kind of to revise the paper. So you're trying to get at a complexity measure to find out whether a particular loan application is very complex or very, very easy to understand. So kind of, I don't know if it's just a roll of the dice, you know, it's a 1/6 chance that any of these numbers happen. So that's a simple problem. And then there are more complicated statistical problems, obviously. So what you're using for the complexity measure is the prediction error. And the prediction error is the absolute difference between the predicted default likelihood and the actual outcome. Okay, so I think what you're thinking about is something like a situation where maybe for some of the loans, there's a very high uncertainty about the true default rate. And maybe for other loans, there's a lower uncertainty about the true default rate. Now, the way that this is designed actually is obviously with the prediction error. While the true default can be 0 or 1, it can default or not. This is a binary outcome variable. So the prediction error here is either PD minus 0, so whatever you predicted minus 0, or it's 1 minus PD, at least the way I understand it, the way it's described in the paper. Okay, and then you average this prediction error kind of conditional on some characteristics. So you're saying, for example, for a FICO of 500, what's the average prediction error? And then a large prediction error is interpreted as a high complexity. Now, this might sound good, but there's a statistical problem with this. And that is for binary dependent variables that can only be 0 or 1, this prediction error is a simple function of the PD. Okay, so for example, I don't know, if you have a probability of default of 75%, then you will have 75% of the observation having a default equal to 1, and 25% observations are down here with the default with the default indicator of 0. So you can show that this prediction error is simply at the end 2 times PD times 1 minus PD. So that's a typical problem for logistic regressions, that they're kind of by definition heteroscedastic here. And so for all probability of defaults of less than 50%, which is clearly the case in almost all lending decisions, this is simply an increasing function of the PD. Okay, so for a PD of 0, you have kind of no prediction error. For PD of 1, you would again have no prediction error, and it's highest in between. But this implies at the end that when you are saying in the paper, machines dominate human beings for high complexity, what you're actually saying is machines dominate human beings for high PD loads. Okay, so there's no possibility with this measure to differentiate between high PD and high complexity. And so I think there are a lot of potential reasons why human beings perform worse for high PD loans that are maybe unrelated to complexity. Okay, so I think this is one of the smaller parts here in the paper, which I suggest you should revisit, because statistically, I think there's really an issue with this. Okay, so to sum up, overall, I think this is both an important topic. I extremely like this. It's a very important market per se, even without understanding whether this is whether this can be applied to other settings or not. The US auto loan market is gigantic, and it's an extremely nice setting because you have random allocation. So the general results that in this type of setting, machines outperform human beings, I found both believable, but also extremely well documented. So suggestion to everyone else, have a look at it. Very interesting paper to read. Thanks a lot for having me discuss or letting me discuss this paper here.
Thank you, Tobias, for the discussion. Now we're going to collect questions from the audience. So please, if you have a question, use the raise hand button on Zoom. Dirk, you can unmute yourself.
Sure. A really interesting paper. It's a great discussion. You may have discussed this and I may have missed it, but there seems to be a sort of selection stage lurking in the background here where you're competing against all the other underwriters and you're going down from 1 million potential loans to 70,000 on each side that are actually being made. And I'm wondering whether the machines versus the humans are just selecting very differently. And I'm sort of trying to think through whether, are you competing against other machines with the other lenders? Are you competing against other humans? And how should I think about that and how that might potentially affect your results? And then how things might change going forward if, say, other lenders are adapting machines as well, but then again, the humans might have a relative advantage, and on and on and on. So maybe you could help us think a little bit about this.
I think this is a really interesting point, and it's the one that we've debated internally a fair bit, right? Which is, certainly in the long run, what we might expect is at some point you're going to be competing with machines. And so certainly in the experimental setting that we see, based on the conversations we've had with other lenders, there are people going in with human underwritten loans. There are lenders going in with machine underwritten loans. So at every auction, there's probably a little bit of both. And so ultimately the assignment comes down to whoever, essentially has won the auction, whoever offers the best terms to the dealership then takes that loan and moves forward with it. So I think the longer term implications here are interesting in the sense that, in the short run, there's going to be some more switching between machines and humans, but certainly, at some point, the industry may end up being dominated by machine underwriting, and there may be less of a role for the human underwriters if we can generalize from these results.
If nobody else has a question, if I could just follow up, Mark, just to make it a bit more precise, I think it would be really interesting to understand whether, and I'm now going to exaggerate things to simplify, whether humans are submitting bad bids relative to the machines into the auctions, or whether, so assume for a moment you had a model where they would get whatever they're bidding and there's no competition, no adverse selection. Are they submitting worse bids than the machines, or are they submitting good bids but are more severely adversely selected because they're not winning the loans where they would have made money? And on and on. I think that would be just kind of an interesting thing to see, sort of where are they falling short? Is it on the bid, or is it on what they actually get conditional on making a bid?
So certainly, I think there's some evidence in the paper that shows that they are in fact submitting inferior bids, right? So the fact that they are putting in bids with lower APRs that on observable dimensions have similar risk profiles suggests to me that, if I have a little bit of wiggle room, I want to make sure I get this thing across the finish line. So maybe I go in at 18.5% instead of 19%, when in fact 19% would have won the auction, right? The machine has no incentives. It simply just prices the loans and it plays out. And you might imagine that a human might, sort of like throw in a bid that's a little bit lower just to be able to ensure that they win, when in fact, it's not like there's thousands of people at the auction. There might be 2 or 3, and the bids might be all over the place. There might be other conditions attached to the loans, like, hey, yeah, we'll give you that better price, but the LTV has to be different, or they have to document the income in some way, right? And so it's not like these bids are coming in sort of in a one-dimensional sense where somebody simply just rank orders the APRs and said, well, this is the best one, let's go with that, right? Because there's sort of other dimensions, right? Like, well, the DTI has to be in place, the LTV, right? The dealer can only make so much margin on these loans, right? And so there's I think more at stake than simply just measuring this on an APR basis. And my sense is that the underwriters are just consistently going in a little bit too cheap. And certainly in some places they're simply just taking on riskier loans where the machine would just decline. Certainly at the LTV thresholds, the evidence is that the machine declines most of those loans versus the humans accept most of those, or approve most of those applications, put in bids, and they're not getting adversely selected in a significant way, meaning like the percentage of bids that they're putting in roughly matches their assignment. So it's not like they're getting a lot more loans below the threshold relative to their bidding. And thank you for clarifying your question.
If there are no more questions, Mark, if you want to answer to the discussant.
Yeah, so I thought that this, and feel free to interrupt me if you do come up with another question. I thought the discussion was super interesting. I found the comments on the information environment particularly thought-provoking. It provides us with another way to think about sort of how our paper fits in with existing literature and sort of how generalizable the results are. I thought that was excellent. With respect to the comment section, that's something that we've been working on. The lender has provided us details of the actual comments attached to each loan. So what we now have is it's actually just a 0-1. We don't know the details of what was in the comment, but what we do know is if a comment was attached to a particular application. And what we have found is that 18% of applications had a comment section. We know that the machine completely ignores these. The human underwriters do have access to these. Unfortunately, there wasn't anything useful that came out of it. It's not like, oh, well, the comments predicted higher default rates. So, I think Tobias' comment is spot on, which is like, well, just how credible are these comments? You might expect, well, this is a good guy. He's got a terrible credit, but he had some bad luck. It's that type of stuff. So our sense is that these comment sections are largely ignored, even though they may have, in some cases, some valuable information. So certainly the other thing that we wanted to bring to light is the fact that the underwriters are rotated. So initially, when they were using human underwriters were assigned specifically to dealerships. The idea was that, as you develop relationships with dealerships, you might gather more information and you might be able to discern the good loans from the bad. But at the same time, there was concern also about potential agency issues where you're sort of trying to help the dealership that you're friends with. So at some point, the company essentially decided the policy would be that the underwriters would be randomly assigned. And so, I think we have something like 120 underwriters. And so at any given time, of the 4,000 dealerships, you might have underwriter 4, underwriter 120. And so there really is no opportunity to sort of discern additional information about the dealership, have any kind of learning going on. At the same time, there's also, from what I could see, no opportunity for agency. It's not like, well, 2 years from now, I might get that dealership assigned to me again, and then we'll give them some special favor. So the comments with respect to complexity, to distinguish between the PD and complexity was super interesting. So we'll have to give that some additional thought. I really appreciate those comments. And let's see, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to. Oh yeah, with respect to incentives, the incentives aren't strictly volume-based incentives, they're also performance-based. So if underwriters are consistently underwriting loans that default, they're either going to get fired or essentially end up sort of, in the penalty box, as it were. And so, there are performance measures. So the dealerships, on the other hand, can throw anything that they want, right? Like once the loans are sold, the dealerships don't care how things play out. The company certainly does. And if underwriters are consistently underwriting poorly performing loans, there are consequences, including termination. So I don't know if I had, that's kind of what I remember off the top of my head. Overall, I love the discussion. We have, Amin is online also, so we have some plenty of material to work on here. And so we do very much appreciate the comments from Tobias and also from the other members of the audience.
There is one last question in the audience from Baozhong. You can unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's a very nice paper. I'm wondering whether you can observe any information about the machine learning models the machines actually use, right? Do they use some simpler models, or they use a very complicated like deep learning models? Is there any information about that that may be helpful?
Yeah, so the model that's used is a simple OLS model. So the model that's used, they simply look at the historical performance of the loans. They essentially run an OLS regression and basically say, well, based on these characteristics, the APR ought to be this. And they use this exact same set of information, the exact same regression, and they essentially create these boxes for the human underwriters using the same information, using the same thing. And these get updated on a quarterly basis. So basically every quarter they go back and look, see, well, how have things changed? How have the market dynamics changed? what's the percentage of loans that we win, and then they kind of rejigger it. In 2020, they moved to a machine learning algorithm, and the initial performance, surprisingly, was actually very poor. And so they're continuing to work on this, but this ends up being outside the scope of sort of what we are looking at here, because we don't actually observe the performance in our sample.
Oh, thank you.
All right. So I'm going to thank Mark and Tobias and all the participants. The next paper is in 5 minutes. The next paper is in the joint asset pricing corporate finance session. So this Zoom session, this room, breakout room, is going to close, and you will be directly redirected to the common session with asset pricing. And the next paper will be in 5 minutes, and it will again be about machines and humans. Stay tuned. See you in 5 minutes.